Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Wire Backstage, bringing you insight, humor, and Michael Knowles. Live to your screen, we are streaming today on Facebook, YouTube, and at thedailywire.com. We got together a few weeks ago for a special Father's Day episode of Backstage, and a few months before that to cover the State of the Union. And tonight, we're happy to come together once again to celebrate America's Independence Day. America. America.
America.
I'm Jeremy Boring, God King of the Daily Wire, lowercase g, lowercase k, so that no one removes my independence from me. And I'm joined by Ben Shapiro, Andrew Klavan, Michael Knowles, Jasper Boring, the chief executive dog of the Daily Wire, and later on, our special guest for the day, Jordan B. Peterson, who is also celebrating a lesser holiday, Canada Day, which was one day ago. Tonight, we're going to talk about America's founding, the 4th of July. We're going to reflect on the ideas of our founders. We're going to examine whether America is holding true to that vision, and we're going to look forward to where we're heading as a country philosophically and politically. One of the great things, though, about these get-togethers is subscriber participation. If you are a dailywire.com subscriber, go to dailywire.com/backstage, and you can submit live questions in the chat box for us to answer tonight. If you are not a subscriber at dailywire.com, you cannot go to dailywire.com/backstage and ask us questions tonight. You can, however, become a subscriber, and then the rules are the same. And not only that, you will get the lovely Leftist Tears, hot or cold, Daily Wire tumbler. You'll get live access to the Ben Shapiro Show, the Andrew Klavan Show, the Michael Knowles Show, the conversation. You'll get to ask questions. It's a party. There's not really much else I can say. With that, we want to introduce our subscriber moderator for the evening. We've known her as a friend, as a co-host with Ben, in his radio days, the lovely, the talented Alicia Krause. Hey, Alicia.
Hey, guys. How are you doing?
Oh, good.
We're having a big time. How are things going in the Subscriber Central?
Yeah, Subscriber Central, which I thought was going to be nicer than Michael Knowles' broom closet, but for some reason,
it's the broom
even
closet of the
crappier
broom
than that.
closet.
Yeah. Cutbacks. Yeah.
So just a reminder to everyone, like Jeremy, our God King with little g and little k said there, to submit your questions and log in to dailywire.com. Head over to the Daily Wire Backstage page to watch and this live stream. Type your question into the Daily Wire chat box, and Jared and I will, call them out, check them out, read them, and get the guys to answer your questions on air.
Alicia, we need to do better than last time. If we get a single question about whether or not Ben Shapiro's wife is actually a doctor, it's just like, honestly, how many times can we answer it?
Is that why you guys are letting a Canadian in that room before me? Just wondering. Is it based solely on my performance?
Dr. Jordan B. Peterson,
That's why. Well, Alicia, we'll be checking in with you from time to time throughout the night. Thanks for taking care of all that.
Yep.
And fellers, someone just said something in my ear. I have no idea what it was. One of the fun things about this show, of course, is that it's live television.
Yeah.
So when they say something in your ear and you don't know what they said, you just keep going.
That's true. That's how I try to do my show. They always say, like, I'll have Ben in my ear. I'll say, stop doing this and leave finally. And I'll say, well, we've got this in the mailbag.
I think he likes me.
Yeah. I couldn't hear that, Ben.
Oh, how wrong he is.
So we're talking about America's Independence Day, and when we first had the idea to do the show, we thought we'd shoot it a couple of days early so that we could actually take the 4th of July off. But of course, in the sort of ironic way that the world comes together, we're actually shooting the show on the day that the founders originally believed would be Independence Day, July 2nd, the day that every one of the original 13 colonies except New York agreed that America should in fact be free and independent from Great Britain. From the Kingdom of Britain, I guess, at the time. One of the things that John Adams said that I thought would be kind of a nice way to kick it off is this. I am apt to believe that this day will be celebrated by succeeding generations as the great anniversary festival. It ought to be commemorated as the day of deliverance by solemn acts of devotion to God Almighty. It ought to be solemnized with pomp and parade, with shows and games, sports, guns, bells, bonfires, and illuminations from one end of this continent to the other, from this time forward forevermore. He was, of course, talking about today, and I like to think that we're honoring him with our very own little mini bonfires here.
Because you always got screwed, John Adams. He was like a short, ugly little man, and Thomas Jefferson was this tall, handsome guy.
Yeah.
And he thought, and this was the day when Adams, through his rhetoric and through his beautiful speaking, convinced the people to essentially signed their death warrant. And he thought, well, they're going to be celebrating me forever, and everybody forgot.
Well, July
and went
4th
to
was,
Lyndon Jefferson.
if I'm not wrong, July 4th was only the day that the Declaration was publicly released.
And they signed.
It was but the
ratified.
resolution for independence was July 2nd. And this puts Adams in the category of all great political pundits, in that he made a very strong prediction and got it completely wrong.
To help us celebrate tonight, we're going to talk about our sponsor for the evening, Expressvpn.
So with all the news about data hacks and breaches and the fact that everybody can take a look at all of your data at any time, no matter what you're doing, it is imperative that you have a VPN. And that's why you should take back your privacy with Expressvpn, because no one in this room uses the internet without it.
It's absolutely true. Expressvpn is the world's leading VPN provider that lets you securely use the internet without being tracked by anyone. Very important for Michael Knowles. Expressvpn keeps your activity private and anonymous while you browse, email, download, or stream. And Expressvpn is good for streaming content as well. They are paying us good money, so I'm going to say this part. You can even use it to watch the World Cup without a cable subscription.
Wow.
Not one of us in this room. Not one of us in this
That's
room.
your thing, gang.
Yeah.
It's all you.
But it is important. You know, first of all, it takes like 90 seconds to put in. And then, you know, if you have a lapse, a little moral lapse, and say you listen to the Knowles show, right?
For instance.
You don't wake up in the middle of the night with that cold sweat thinking somebody saw that. If I ever run for office, I'm finished. Like, no one knows.
Look, there are some things you look at.
You can take back your internet privacy to go to expressvpn.com/Ben, because I'm the most famous of us. expressvpn.com/Ben.
Who are you again?
express.com. I'll tell you, vpn.com/Ben. For 3 months for free with a 1-year package. Again, that's expressvpn.com/Ben to check it out. And you really should have it. It's a terrific service. We all use it. So go check it out now.
And they make it possible for us to do whatever this is that we're
So far, it's been amazing.
that we're doing. Yeah.
It's
So
been a strong lead.
I think one of the things that we take for granted, of course, we're fairly patriotic people here in America. We're a young enough country that, as a general rule, we still celebrate things like the founding. People know, at least have a cursory understanding of the sort of mythology of the American founding. I think what's missing more and more, though, is a philosophical understanding of the founding. The question isn't what is America, it's why is America? And I feel like, especially right now in this moment, sort of an unideological moment on the right. You know, we read a lot in the sort of Trump debates that take place on the right about how we shouldn't be a party of principle, we should be a party of interests. And of course, interests are part of our principle. That's part of what it means to be on the right. One thing that Ben and I were discussing is, you know, a man can die. A man can fight for his interests, but he can only die for his principles. By definition, you can't die for your interests.
Right.
So I think that rather than forsake our principles, it's the job of conservatives and to use our voice to remind people of those principles and to show them how the two things aren't exclusive, how the pursuit of our interests is the pursuit of our higher principles.
Well, I think one of the worst things that I've heard said over the last 10 years is in Barack Obama's second inaugural address. First of all, he was inaugurated a second time, which is terrible in and of itself. But in the inaugural address, do you remember that he said something to the effect of, what America means is that we each get to define liberty in our own way? And I thought to myself, that is like the exact opposite of what the Declaration of Independence says, because the Declaration of Independence basically defines liberty. It says what liberty is you have these inalienable rights or unalienable rights. Jefferson Adams argued over the actual wording of that. And these unalienable rights pre-exist government, and government is created in order to preserve those rights. And the minute that it starts to violate those rights, governments become illegitimate, and then you can abolish those governments. So the view of liberty was always what we would now call negative liberty, that that it was the government not invading your rights. Those were the rights that pre-existed governments. It was the rights to life, liberty, and property in sort of the Lockean formula, or in the Declaration of Independence formula, it was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, once you start defining liberty as whatever you want it to be, and then you disconnect it completely from virtue, because that was the other half. Right, pursuit of happiness, when Thomas Jefferson says pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence, he doesn't mean pursuit of having a hot dog on the 4th of July. He actually means, in the ancient definition of happiness, he means that happiness is supposed to be connected with virtue.
Eudaimonia, right?
Right, exactly. And all of that was supposed to be connected with teleology and telos, the idea that you were directed towards certain ends, and using those ends is what was going to bring you happiness, that acting in accordance with right reason in the Aristotelian sort of sense, that was what was going to make you happy. So the pursuit of happiness was the pursuit of virtue. These were consonant. And instead what it's turned into for a lot of people is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means leave me alone, I get to do whatever I want unless I screw up, in which case I need you to pay for it, and the government gets to invade everybody else's rights in order so that we can pay for all of these things.
And the ancients did know that form of liberty, that where you make an idol out of liberty, leads to tyranny inevitably.
Yep.
And they knew that. And one of the things You know, I don't worry much, because if things are going well, I just figure they'll just go well forever. That always works out.
So far, so
yeah, exactly. It's like falling off the Empire State Building. Things are going well so far, you know. But one of the things that is worrying after these 2 weeks of Supreme Court decisions is how entirely the left has abandoned the processes that were put in place to preserve our liberty. Yeah. And one of the reasons I understand when you guys worry about Trump more than I do, but I know that Trump doesn't really care about those things. And so it does devolve on people like us and people who talk and think and write to protect the processes themselves, even when we lose a fight. You can lose a fight and still maintain those processes when you allow the left to speak. And you say the First Amendment, yes, protects you from in saying that horrible, hateful thing. You're defending the process even though the left speaks. It's very disturbing right now that the left is basically saying, no. If you say certain things, then the First Amendment isn't worth
preserving. Did you see that 2,000-word piece on the front page of the New York Times?
I read it on the air today.
Yeah, so did I. Right? Yeah. I mean, about that whole thing about how conservatives are utilizing the First. What was the word? Weaponizing the First Amendment, which is a phrase from our esteemed Justice Elena Kagan, who's dean of law school, and I was there. And I used to get into it with her when she was dean of the law school, because that's who she was then. But it is astonishing that they've decided that the First Amendment, because it does not serve their purposes, is no longer worth preserving.
They're like Erdogan in Turkey, who said democracy is like a streetcar. When you reach your stop, you get off. It's like they have reached their stop in terms of what they want to have free speech about, and if it's different, and if it's us having free speech,
well, the great hubris of the left, and it's not just the American left, it's the global left, is that they believe in the concept of the end of history. They believe that eventually they win and that's it. And so they get ahead of themselves all the time. Whenever they get a little victory,
they've already won, right?
They've won.
They're just playing out.
That's right. The reason that they're so incensed over Trump is because they really thought that they would never lose another election. Barack Obama happened. That was an event in human history from their point of view. It was the changing of the world to this new order. They're never, don't look back. You can never look back. And because of that, they always use their power to alter things to their immediate benefit, with the assumption that the guys they don't like will never be the ones in possession of that new power.
Of course.
And a great case in point, of course, is the filibuster rules for judicial nominees right now that we're talking about in the Senate. But that's not the only one of these rules. The making the Census Bureau an executive agency is a more sort of subtle version of this, but where they're just constantly increasing the power of the institutions of power whenever they control them, because it never occurs to them.
On immigration.
That's right. And so Barack Obama uses executive orders, the pen and the phone throughout his presidency, to sort of by fiat bring about this left-wing utopia. It never occurs to them, well, if you can pass regulation that way, the next guy can unpass.
This is also connected, obviously, historically to the changing of what the federal government was supposed to do at the beginning of the 20th century with the progressive movement, where Woodrow Wilson becomes in his own words, he becomes the great avatar of the will of the people, which is a very Rousseau notion that suddenly...
He's very honest about it.
Oh, yeah, no, he says that the Constitution has to be overthrown, the Constitution is hackneyed and it's old and it's got these weird definitions of liberty, and instead what we really need is a government of the best people that is going to act as the generalized will of the people. To really understand the Declaration of Independence and how great it is, you really do have to juxtapose it to the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and how crappy it is. Right? Everybody likes to talk about the French Revolution as this great epic of changing of history. The French Revolution was freaking awful.
It was a disaster.
It was awful.
It was a disaster.
It was awful, and we're still living out like every element of the French Revolution. Every bad idea of the French Revolution was eventually carried forward in the worst possible way in the 20th century. So the idea of the equality of man was carried out in communism. The idea of the idea of romantic nationalism that began with the French Revolution was carried out in Nazism. The idea of the bureaucrats that were going to control everything from above, that was something that carried itself out in
the IRS and Obama.
Really? I mean, no, but seriously, that's actually right. I mean, the creation of a bureaucracy, of a bureaucratic country, that starts with Auguste Comte, right? I mean, the idea that all of these experts are going to run everything for you, right? These have deep roots in a belief, in essence, that the collective rules the individual. And that's the real difference between the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Declaration of Independence. Declaration of Independence says, you're individuals with rights, right? This is based in Judeo-Christian values. Right? This is the big difference. The Declaration of the Rights of Man says nothing about God. It says everything about the people. The Declaration of Independence says a lot about God and a few things about the people, but it really is mostly about the idea that individuals are granted God-given rights, right, based in the notion that we are all made in God's image. The difference between the English the English Enlightenment and the Scottish Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment is the English and Scottish Enlightenments both held fast to Judeo-Christian values, and the French Enlightenment overturned them, and in the phrase that you like to quote, was trying to strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest.
And it's also, I mean, this is a Burkean notion. I know you're not a big Burke fan, but I actually
I do like
Burke.
I
like Burke, and I think that the Americans, the founders, actually had a deep affection for the traditions that had created the place that they had gotten to, and they preserved it in the documents, which is a beautiful thing, to write down those unspoken things that are just kind of in your blood, to put them down so you can then move on to the next place.
This is the key tool that the left uses, specifically on independence, is ignorance. Ignorance of what the Declaration says, ignorance of the glorious revolution and the divergences and how Americans saw their rights and how the British saw their rights in America. There were these polls that came out a few years ago. 40+% of Americans don't know that America declared independence on July 4th, 1776. 14 or 15% of teenagers said that we declared independence from France in July 4th, 1776. There's this...
if only.
If only. And, you know, when they talk about it, when Howard Zinn talks about it, or high school kids, or college kids, they talk about the Declaration, they say, oh, it was these rich white men who were protecting their own property, they were just protecting their own money. It's not a philosophical document. The way they get away with that line is because people don't read the document.
Yeah.
It's right there. It's right there in the papers that they wrote about the signing of the Declaration. They were signing their death warrants, defending the rights that God had given man, giving practical grievances against a king, creating an English basis, a traditional basis for breaking away from England. It's one of the most beautiful documents.
I think this is one of the things we're actually talking about at some level, is the left did this on purpose.
Yeah.
They inculcated ignorance in a generation, 2 generations really, to stop them from knowing what it is who it is we are, and why it is we do what we do. And the thing is, this year when you finally sent me out talking to college campuses, and there's been a lot of people objecting, including my wife, but I find I'm talking to these brilliant kids. They're very smart, but they don't know anything. They don't know what, you know, even the conservatives don't understand why we do what we do and what they were arguing about. Why did they say you should have guns? Why did they say, you know, that freedom of speech was the First Amendment? Why? They don't know.
Because the left has gotten so cynical, and they've always been so cynical, that they think all of politics is just about power relations.
Yes.
And so when they look at the Declaration of Independence, right,
it
is. I mean, in the end, they believe that the reason that the world is a flawed place is because of flawed power relations that are written into the system itself. So whenever they see an injustice, it's the entire system has to be torn down, which is what you're seeing with the rise of these socialist idiots, right? These people like Ocasio-Cortez, right? These people who don't know, she clearly doesn't know anything, right? And she's coming forward and saying that America is just this series of power relations where she grew up in relative privilege.
She's
in
my
the United
neighbor.
States.
She and I grew up in neighboring towns. I grew up in a less affluent town than the girl from the Bronx, Ocasio-Cortez. But yeah, we were neighbors, and she pretends to be something that she isn't.
But by casting politics always as a series of power relations, then they get to say that anything that maintains the power relations is bad. And so that's how they get to the point where they say the First Amendment is bad, because anything that maintains the current system itself is bad, and the First Amendment is part of the current system, and therefore it has to be overturned. So this goes all the way back in terms of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, to Charles Beard, who at the beginning of the 20th century was making the argument that the founders were attempting to enshrine their own property ownership, and that's really what the founding was all about. Okay, as you say, the reality is Robert Livingston lost literally everything. He was one of the richest people in the colonies when this all started. He lost his house, he lost his wealth, he lost everything. He died in poverty because he signed the Declaration of Independence, and he wasn't the only one. I mean, there are a lot of people who lost everything because of all this. And when people
know that Washington, Mount Vernon, the British pulled up a ship to Mount Vernon, and the caretaker of Mount Vernon, who was a relative of Washington, went out and was so afraid of losing the general's home that he went out and basically parleyed with the British a little bit, and they had a meal together and sort of made nice for just long enough that they didn't burn Washington's place to the ground. Washington, when he heard about this, was out.
The Continental Congress, I think it was Benjamin Harrison of Virginia, said to Eldridge Gerry, I believe, of Massachusetts, Harrison was much fatter, and he said, you know, I've got a real advantage on you, Mr. Gerry, because when I'm hanging for this, I'm going to die within about 3 seconds, and you're going to be dangling for several minutes. And they were open. It was
well, that's the famous Franklin line, right? We'll either hang together or we'll all hang separately.
That's right, yeah.
So, I mean, there's no question the amount of risk that was undertaken by the founders to do this thing, fighting the most powerful army on earth at the time. It's an amazing act of bravery, and to try and take that away from people because of historical circumstance. By saying the Declaration of Independence was a document not about liberty, but it was about enshrining slavery, is such it's ahistorical nonsense. The original draft of the Declaration of Independence included a section ripping into the King of England for having made slavery a part of the American way. It was written by Jefferson, and it was only the southern states threatening to pull out of the convention itself that amounted to him pulling that out. And when that happened, John Adams said, in a moment of real prophecy, he said, if we do this, in 80 years there will be a great war in this country. Right? And he was exactly right, almost to the date. Right? Because everyone knew at the time that slavery was a major issue. But anyone who reads the Declaration of Independence as a document that's enshrining slavery ignores the words of Frederick Douglass, ignores the words of Martin Luther King, ignores the words of Booker T. Washington, ignores the words of Abraham Lincoln, but all of the truly great black leaders in this country who saw the Declaration of Independence as a call to freedom that had gone unfulfilled. As opposed to a document that was enshrining a system that made them slaves in the first place.
It could not have been about the pursuit of their interests because of how many of them died in their thousands for it. You cannot die in pursuit of your interests.
And that's the great Martin Luther King line, which is a Burkean line, is live out the meaning of your creed. It's not ditch the creed, you bums.
That's why I hate the whole kneeling for the national anthem thing. Like it's just stupid.
Yeah, that's right.
The point of it is that if you feel that we're not living up to the national anthem, what you should be doing is standing with your hand over your heart during the national anthem and then saying, I want to stand over there with my hand because I'm standing for the national anthem, and that means that you should be standing with me when I'm ripping into
I agree with that.
X, Y, or Z.
Let's see what our subscribers have to say by checking in from Subscription Central. I mean, I made it up, but I'm going to roll with it. Elisha Krauss.
Subscription Central is still real tiny over here. I'd appreciate some air, some snacks, something. I don't know.
There is no air.
You're talking to the wrong people.
I don't know. Like, do I need to
stogie?
join
We
a
can get you
union? Ben was just talking about Jefferson, and Bradley asks along those lines, and he says that Jefferson wrote that our unalienable rights are self-evident, but are they? And if so, wouldn't all societies naturally realize them?
This is a great question. So the answer is, of course...
We disagree with you.
So, right. So, the answer is, of course, they're not self-evident, but Jefferson didn't mean they were self-evident to any person on earth. He meant to any right-thinking person who had grown up in the context of Judeo-Christian values. Right? That's the real answer, right? The real answer is that, of course, Jefferson wasn't a fool. He knew that most people on earth did not see these rights as self-evident. He meant that these rights were self-evident given a certain set of premises, including the idea that all people were created in the image of God, and the idea that Englishmen had rights. Then it was self-evident that the rest of this follows. But if you don't have, this is where we make a mistake when we think that we can just take the rights that were generated over the course of 2,000 years of Judeo-Christian history and 1,500 years of Greek theorizing. You can take those and just implant them anywhere in the world without any sort of military force. That if you just spread the seeds, then the roots will grow. It's just not true. You have to actually acknowledge that there is a cultural history that pre-exists the founding of the United States, and that is the soil from which all of this grows. And without that soil, you're spreading seeds on cement. It's just not going to go anywhere. And I think Jefferson knew that. He wasn't a foolish man.
I think that when he said self-evident, I don't think he meant actually readily apparent. I think he meant axiomatic, that the only evidence for them was the only evidence necessary for them was themselves. That once you saw them, I mean, something can be self-evident and nobody discovers it for 2,000 years, but then once you discover it, you know it. And you're absolutely right that the culture and the custom has to be there. The underlying principles have to be there to lift you to that place where you see it. But it doesn't mean that it's self-evident. Doesn't mean, oh, anybody can see it. It means once you see it, it doesn't have to be proved.
Right, and this is where patriotism and nationalism come together. So there's been this great debate on the right now about patriotism versus nationalism. There are people like me and Jonah Goldberg who have been, quasi anti-nationalism but very pro-patriotism, saying that America is a creedal country. And then there are people like Rich Lowry and Ross Douthat who have made the argument that America is more nationalistic in the sense that we share history and a culture and all of this. Right, it's a place, it's borders, and I think that the reality, obviously, and I think everybody would in this conversation would agree with this, is that it's both. That you can't have patriotism without the nationalism. That this all pre-existed, and that and it says this in the Federalist Papers, right? That this was a uniquely created group of people who all shared a common culture and common history, and that led to a common thought pattern that led to the creation of this republic. And that without that, you can't have patriotism in the first place. This stuff, in other words, did not come out of nowhere. And I think this is the big mistake I'm seeing in a lot of pro-Enlightenment books that are happening right now. There's a big pro-Enlightenment movement, which is great. I love the Enlightenment, but there's a lot happening in the Enlightenment movement that is saying that the Enlightenment is a gap in kind from what came before it. That basically there was a sharp break and then lightning struck, and in 1760 people started realizing what the world was about, and that's just not true. Because Enlightenment without biblical principle ends up in French Revolution tyranny, and biblical principle without Enlightenment ends up in theocracy.
And one of the interesting questions about the rights, especially from the Bill of Rights, from the Constitution, which comes a bit later, of course, there's a question: can God give rights that God opposes? Right? And so, if you take the right to privacy as understood in the Roe decision, that there is an intrinsic right to abortion granted in the Constitution, could God grant the right to do something that God himself would abhor? Jefferson actually spoke about this in the Virginia Charter on Religious Liberty. He wrote the preamble, and one of the amazing things about it, it's a legal argument that he makes, but he makes a legal argument, and the case law on which he bases his premise is the Bible. And he basically says, since God alone has the right and the power to, this is a summary, the right and the power to force his will upon others, and since he chose not to, doesn't it necessarily mean that we who don't have the right or the power should also not do so? So in other words, I think that what Jefferson is saying is that, you know, we base all of this on the concept of a God who gave us the freedom to fail, who gave us the freedom to do things even when those things themselves don't work.
You know, it's funny. People write in a lot and they ask, how can you believe in God with the existence of evil? But the existence of evil has always proved to me God's dedication to our freedom. The fact that he will actually put freedom above incidental morality, that he actually respects our right. Because how can you love God? How can you love anybody if you're not free?
Yeah, at least human evil. I think the harder version of the question is natural evil, right? Like
yes, that is a much harder.
Except that I think Kierkegaard's point right on this is that basically, since just like all of our rights are negative rights, all the great proofs of God are negative proofs. It's the existence of imperfection that implies perfection. If the requirement of belief in perfection was to encounter perfection, I think we'd be sorely lacking both naturally and in the human experience on this world.
I'd like to go back to the nationalism thing. I absolutely agree with you that it's a matter, nationalism and patriotism have to come together, because what kind of person would you be? This Enlightenment movement has a lot of Vulcans in them. Borrowing a phrase from Jonah Goldberg, that Vulcans who do not seem to see that human beings have a kind of natural affection, natural affections, natural passions. You know, it of course, there is a point where your country does something so wrong, so bad, so evil that you have to turn away. You have to stand up for the principle above the country. But what would you be if you didn't have some natural, visceral love for the land that
you would be less than human.
That's right.
You would be less than there. You know, we aren't just like spirits floating in the air. There is a fleshiness to us, and we are in a place at a time. You know, 4th of July bunting in Sag Harbor and on the Jersey Shore.
Well, this is
this
is right. What they've actually shown, their studies on this, that if you take a kid to a July 4th parade, that kid is significantly more likely to vote conservative than if you don't take a kid to a 4th.
That's right.
Yeah, because listen, I grew up. I mean, we can do this. This is kind of fun. So, what is? I'm curious what your guys' most patriotic sort of defining piece of entertainment or literature was when you were growing up. So for me, it was very easy, right? For me, it was the movie 1776. When I was growing up, we used to watch that incessantly. My dad actually had a page from the original score because he knew the composer, and so every Halloween and Purim, the Jewish kind of Halloween, I would dress up as John Adams. There are tons of pictures of me in like the red coat and the wig and the whole deal. Like, I grew up on that stuff, and it made a huge impression on me, because I remember the first book I ever read was a biography of Benjamin Franklin, like the first chapter book. I remember being 4 or 5 years old and reading a biography of Benjamin Franklin and walking around reading it, about how he had invented the swimming implements with his thumbs and all this kind of thing. And growing up with a love for the history of the United States is necessary, because otherwise you have no connection to the greatness of what it is that we live in. If you don't know the history, you don't know the greatness. Right? What was yours?
Well, I have to tell you, I go back so far that I remember.
You remember the founding.
I remember the founding itself. I remember the moment
when New York burned. Drew, watching from a hill in Jersey, it shed a single
wistful tear.
I can remember. This will kill you though. I can remember the moment that somebody offhandedly, I must have been 6th or 7th grade, so pretty old, pretty up there. I remember the moment when a teacher said offhandedly, of course, George Washington never actually chopped down a cherry tree. And I went, of course, because I didn't know. I thought all that stuff was true. That's what they taught us when I was little. They taught us that stuff. The other thing that really had an effect on me is back in the day, you couldn't get any movie you wanted. You could only get the movies that were on TV. So I grew up watching the same movies my parents grew up watching, because those were the movies on TV. Those Westerns shaped my mind about what a man is, what the country was, what it meant to be an individual standing up for the good. The idea of Gary Cooper walking down the street because that's what you did, that was the right thing, even when everybody else turned away. And that was America to me. You know, like the idea that your individual liberty was individual license. It couldn't occur to you once you'd seen Gary Cooper walk down that street. You knew your individual liberty was individual responsibility because you had seen those movies, and they shaped my entire worldview. And it shows you what that meant, that empire of the Jews in Hollywood who loved this country so much and created a liberal vision in the sense that it took in everybody and accepted everybody, but also a conservative vision in that it accepted everybody into an establishment of rules and responsibilities.
Reverent.
And a reverent love of the country. And that had a huge effect on me.
Before we go further, I want to kick to Elisha. Elisha, what's your answer to this question? We're talking about what were the influences on us in our young life, literature, cultural, that gave us our love for our country.
Yeah, I think mine was familial because there are many men in my family that have served in the military. And thank you to all of those watching and all of our subscribers and viewers that have made that sacrifice for their country. And I think mainly my paternal grandfather, my pa, Ree Blankenship, was a World War II veteran. So I grew up going to the barbershop with him and going to VFW dinners with him and meeting fellow World War II veterans and hearing their stories, hearing why they loved America, hearing why they chose to serve their country was just inspiring. And kind of like Klavan too, because of my paternal grandfather, I also grew up watching John Wayne movies. And John Wayne is the epitome, I think, of a real man's man. And I think that those are probably things that have attracted a lot of young conservatives or conservative Americans, and it's that cultural, of course, like your late friend Andrew Breitbart always talked about, the cultural effect on politics and how culture in Hollywood can, change people's perspective.
The answer for me growing up, and these are all really early childhood memories, is the flag. It's the, I wear this bow tie a lot. I'm not wearing it ironically. I'm really not. It looks ironic, I really love the flag. I also really like bow ties. But I really like the flag. When I was a little kid, the first song I ever learned, I must have been 2 years old, my grandfather, who was a World War II vet, flew a B-24 Navigator, he played for me It's a Grand Old Flag by George M. Cohan. It's a grand old flag, it's a high flying, right? And I'd march around the dining room. I loved the song. And even going down to my other grandfather, another Navy vet, Purple Heart in Vietnam, later war, he would raise the flag on his flagpole at his home every morning and lower the flag if it were raining. And there's a respect for the flag as the symbol of the country, but a real tangible symbol. And I remember this, I forget if this was Hillary or Obama, during the campaign, one of their campaign aides tweeted out a picture of a flag crumpled along the floor. And they said, we're setting up for the new rally and whatever. And they didn't know. The flag doesn't touch the floor. When I was a kid, if I had a little flag on the 4th of July, I put it on the table or the ground or whatever, my mother would say, pick that up. Pick that up. Don't you ever let the flag touch the ground. And I don't know if kids are taught this today. I'm really not sure. I know that the Hillary or Obama or whichever campaign aides, they were not taught that. I don't think it was malicious what they said. I think they just were ignorant. And so they put a flag on the ground, the height of disrespect, and it's no coincidence that utter irreverence, that utter lack of respect is done by the same people who are profane in their speech, the people who use the F word all the time and don't. It's that matter of respect. It really is an essential aspect of patriotism.
Yeah. For me, there were probably a few moments of influence, but two of them that stand out. One, my family ran a fireworks stand. And so the 4th of July was this special time every year where for a couple of weeks you would sit in 105-degree Texas heat in an unair-conditioned box with no adults, surrounded by high explosives.
Dynamite.
Surrounded basically by dynamite.
That's America right there.
Yeah. So my uncle, who's a year younger than I am, and I would, at 9, 10, 11, very young, spend because for the first 2 weeks nobody buys fireworks. So we would just sit out there and sweat nearly to death, surrounded by the explosives. And my grandparents' home was, I don't know, half a mile away, but they could see the fireworks stand from their kitchen window. And so if a customer actually did pull up, they'd usually jump in the car and come on over. By the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, of course, that's when everyone actually buys their fireworks, and they would kick us out. But we would have earned enough money in the 2 weeks of just sitting out there literally losing probably 90% of our body weight, that we could spend all the money we had just made buying the fireworks. And then we would spend the next 3 days trying to blow our fingers off. But
which he still does, by the way, I can testify, yes.
I've been known to throw quite a 4th of July shindig back in the great state of Texas. Also my wedding anniversary, the 4th of July. And so the sort of aesthetic culture, which wasn't ideological in any way, it was just the aesthetics of the American founding were always just a big part of the background of my childhood.
Let me ask
I was at his last 4th of July. Was it last year?
Yeah, we were down there.
And he set off these fireworks. My wife has not forgiven me. She thought we were going to get killed, and so we all went out. We thought it would be funny. Huge wind coming in off the Texas prairie. This big sandstorm coming in, and we decided to set off the fireworks with our cigars.
It was
beautiful. But Jay Hay, our Jonathan Hay, who is I have no idea what his title is anymore. He's running everything, basically. He decides that the way to do this is with the cigar in his teeth, and so he's leaning in, and I'm looking at him, and I'm thinking, this might not be good. and yet he's with us this very day.
To this very day.
So let me ask the depressing follow-up. When's the last time you saw a patriotic movie?
Okay.
I mean, like a modern patriotic movie. What's the last time they made one?
Maybe American Sniper in its way.
Right. I think that
in its way.
In its way, and even there, it's like it's patriotic, but it's also all the downsides of America's wars and all this kind of stuff. Like, when's the last time you saw an outright patriotic film?
Hail Caesar. I know nobody saw it. Only we saw it.
I
but it was
loved
a patriotic from the Coen brothers. It was a patriotic movie.
I mean, I agree, but I think that it's sort of done, let's say, a quarter tongue-in-cheek, half tongue-in-cheek. Like, I don't think that they make patriotic film anymore. I just don't. I think
they certainly don't make those unbridled. It's a grand old flag.
I'll challenge you.
They took the American way out of Superman's slogan.
Amazing.
I'll challenge you on this. Just in one way, yes, Hollywood, especially because in the 90s, the early 2000s, the whole financing model of Hollywood changed to where Americans weren't paying for American movies, and so why would they have American values in them, right? But that's a lengthy conversation for another day. There is one piece of culture which, as recently as the 90s, was so deeply infused with Americanism and with masculinity and with Christianity, and it is the second piece of my answer about how was I exposed to these ideas as a child, and that was country music.
Country music, exactly.
I think country music, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that country music has helped save our country over the last 25 years. This is right. So
I had no experience. I'm a Jewish boy, right? We have no experience with country music. And I remember my dad and two of my sisters and I did a road trip back from Chicago to LA because my grandmother was giving us a car. And as we're driving, there are no radio stations anywhere on that drive, right? There's only the one country radio station. It's the same country radio station playing the same 5 songs. And as we were listening, we're like, wow, this sort of music actually exists where people are talking about, like, they actually talk about having kids. When's the last pop song that you heard where they talk about having kids? Never. No one has ever had a child in a pop song. They've only had random sex with beautiful strangers.
That's
but
right.
they've never actually had a child in a pop song. And they certainly have never celebrated with their kids on the deck with a beer looking at the flag, right? Which you hear in every other country song. This is totally correct. And this is why when people from the coasts in the media, like Washington, D.C., New York, L.A., people who I grew up with, right? Because that's, you grew up in Texas, right?
I'm a coastal guy, too.
Right. The other 3 of us are coastal. But if you grew up in these areas, the idea that there's an entire different culture in the center of the country where they feel just differently about the soil and the flag and about family,
right.
it's there really is this massive cultural disconnect, and that's why, like, for me as an Orthodox Jew going to Oklahoma, the first time I went to Oklahoma and I was talking culture with people, I'm like, I have way more in common with this person in Oklahoma because I'm a religious person than I do with all the people I grew up with in Los Angeles. It's bizarre.
And speaking of Oklahoma, Elisha, we're gonna we want to check in and get another question answered.
I just love that Oklahoma and country music, 2 of my loves,
I know.
just got a shout out in that segment from our very own Ben Shapiro.
And Elisha, while you speak to our subscribers, I'm going to honor the subscribers of our allies and sometimes competitors, CRTV, by utilizing my favorite ashtray, which can be yours if you go to louderwithcrowder.com and become a subscriber at whatever that thing is that he's hustling.
Oh goodness! Every show? Are we going to do that every show?
I do it
100% of the time.
I'll be just sitting out on the balcony in the middle of the day writing a thing. I've got that beautiful Crowder ashtray going with my news.
It is actually a policy at the Daily Wire that if you are going to smoke a cigar, your ash must be deposited.
You know that jerk
in the
says
letter
that that jerk says that our tumblers are filled with asbestos, and the only proof of that is Klavan.
Elisha, what do our subscribers have to say?
So Ariana has a question that is on everyone's mind. She wants to know, what on God's green earth is Michael Knowles wearing?
Well, you can take that one of two ways there, Michael.
Too much, they always say. Wearing too much. I'm wearing America, I would say that would be how I would describe it.
America, America.
It's very important.
That smoking jacket is not American.
This is
British,
Italian a little bit.
British pansy over there.
It's very important though. We're talking about civility is in the news these days. It's very important to wear the right thing. We're talking about teleology. Things have purpose. When you smoke, you can't just. I can't just wear like a jean jacket and use an ashtray. I have to wear a smoking jacket, which has the purpose of taking on the smoke, and Stephen Crowder mug, which has the purpose of taking the ash.
He's the worst.
I have to say, if you were Knowles, if you were wearing a jean jacket and had an ashtray, you would be much more like that John Wayne of real manly fare.
No, I just end up like a
significantly better shot than Knowles wore jean shorts. He wears a jean jacket.
I end up looking a little too Bruce Springsteen.
I'm tired of this question. Elisha, give us another one.
All right, I really like this question from Julian. He says, Daily Wire fellas, I'm proud of my Mexican ancestry, but also am proud of my American nationality. How do I balance these two things?
Super simple. Celebrate Cinco de Mayo because you are proud of your Mexican heritage. Believe that it is Mexico's Independence Day because you have American nationality.
Well, I mean, I think that the truth is that this is the other half of the patriotism nationalism question, and that is that because America is creedal, we can take people from all different cultures and ethnicities. I mean, my great-great-grandparents got here in 1907, and coming from Eastern Europe and with no American background at all, and they came in and they became American. Like that's so you can celebrate where you come from, particularly the cultural aspects of where you come from, so long as they are not in conflict with the American creed. And I think this is where we get into some serious issues when it comes to immigration, because it is not clear that immigration from all parts of the globe or from all cultures is equally capable of merging with American ideals. And so it's imperative that when we bring people in, these are people who are willing to undergo the stress that is necessary to assimilating into these American ideals. These ideals have to stand above and beyond ethnicity and culture. They have to be above and beyond those things. And I think that one of the big problems with multiculturalism and the press for quote-unquote diversity is that it's not diversity as in we like Mexican food, or you have Mexican grandparents, or you still have a fondness for Mexico as a country because this is where your family came from. All that's fine. But what we've got now is this idea that you don't actually have to assimilate into American ideals of limited government and individual responsibility and freedom from government and certain values that are unique to the United States in order to be given the same level of respect. And you do. You have to assimilate. When my great-great-grandparents got here, there used to be it's fascinating now. If you're a second-generation person who is immigrating now, the chances are much better that you will not speak English than they were when my great-great-grandparents got here. When my great-great-grandparents got here, they would not speak Yiddish in the house with their kids because they wanted their kids to learn English so that they could do business and assimilate and deal with everybody else. And again, I come from a culture where Jews are still supposed to marry Jews, right? So this wasn't about assimilating in the sense that you're supposed to just kind of generally merge into the population. It was the idea that you're supposed to accept these certain basic principles. So there's no conflict in my mind whatsoever in enjoying all the aspects of your culture, knowing your history, which is just cool stuff. It's cool to know your own personal history, valuing those parts of your history that merge with these creedal ideals. But the creed has to come over everything, or you haven't become part of the American nation.
I would add one thing to this, which is ask yourself the question, why did my forebears choose to leave behind Mexico, for example, or Italy, Sicily, or wherever you're from. And why did they make the choice to leave that behind? That's not necessarily a condemnation at a macro level of every single thing about the culture that brought you here. But it is something. It does mean something that people, many times at great risk to themselves, to their safety, to their economic situation, they would take all the money that they had and traveled across oceans, across deserts to get here. Why?
And I think this is it's an interesting idea, because the fact is that we tend to think of it, I think, in more intellectualized terms than it actually happened in immigration. We tend to think of it as, I was sitting in Eastern Europe and then I decided, look at this Declaration of Independence. It's incredible. I'm going to go there because look at their creed. And really what it was is the way America used to work in terms of immigration because there was no handout, because there was no social safety net. You were leaving behind everything that you had and coming here with nothing and no guarantee that you would get anything. So we drew an enormous number of risk-seeking people who were coming here because they would rather give up everything for the possibility of having more than stay where they were and grasp onto what they had with the possibility of no growth.
It is, it's actually immigration that pulls into focus the emptiness of leftism, the emptiness of what the left is offering. Because it is, as you say, you do come here, you have cast your lot with us, and what we are is a creed. We are a creed. That is what we are. If they took all of us and moved us to Canada, then Canada would become America because we would bring that creed with us. And boy, wouldn't Canada be lucky then.
You know, I actually think I have the solution on all of these ideas. The solution, if you're worried about how to blend your Mexican heritage with your American nationality, go visit Mexico. Go visit Mexico. I mean this. Half of my family came here on the Mayflower. They fought in the American Revolution, waspy as can be. Half of them came on a sardine boat from Sicily. I thought as a kid, I'm going to go to Italy. It's going to be the mother country. I'm going to feel home. I love going to Italy for about a week. I really like going to Italy for about a week. And then I get a little upset because, you know, the stores just aren't open. Yeah. And people don't do anything, and they behave a little weird.
They sell a lot more Mexico flags in America than they do in Mexico.
You know, you were talking about patriotic movies, and this is not a particularly patriotic movie, but it did have one scene in it, this movie Bridge of Spies, a Spielberg movie with Tom Hanks, where Hanks goes to the Soviet Union, and he sees people trying to escape over the Berlin Wall, trying to climb the Berlin Wall and getting shot down. And then he's in a train back in America, and he sees in this beautiful echo, only Spielberg is this smart with a camera, he sees kids jumping over fences as play in America. They're free. They can just jump over the fence and they just go. That didn't drop out of the sky. That didn't come out of, that's not magic. We built that. This country built it. We didn't build it, but our forefathers built it and bled for it and died for it. And so if you don't respect that, you shouldn't be here.
And it's one of the great lies of the left. You hit on this a second ago, but I think you have to take it the rest of the way. The left promotes the idea that America is a place, not a creed. They basically suggest that the reason we have everything that we have is because we, by fortune and conquest, took the most fertile piece of ground on earth, and that's where we've made our home. And a lot of you get this from sort of Mexican nationalists in America, La Raza and others, who basically think, you know, if we could take back the land that you took away from us in the war with Mexico in the 1840s or whatever it was, or 1830s. If you could take that, if we could have that land back, look how fertile and good it is. But of course, that land is exactly the same as the land in Mexico. The difference is that on this side of an imaginary boundary, certain ideas are in place, and on the other side of the imaginary boundary, other ideas are in place. And the truth is, if we took the southwestern United States and gave it back to Mexico, it would, in 2 generations, look exactly like Mexico. Right. And if you took northern Mexico and gave it to the United States, in 2 generations, it would look like everywhere else in the United States, because it's not race, obviously, very mixed backgrounds here. It's not land. It's not natural resources. It's not conquest. It's the ideas.
It's ideas. Ideas. It's incredible to me how much the left denigrates ideas and how powerful ideas actually are. Yep. When I heard David Brooks recently say, you know, there's not terrorism in the Islam world because Muhammad came down. It's because these young men are out of work. I thought, what on
That's the
earth
stupidest
are
crap.
you
Obama
talking
said the same
about?
stuff. You remember he said in Dreams from My Father?
Yes.
At the very beginning, he says that the same despair drives the youths of South Central Chicago as drives the youths of Jakarta. And it's like, this is such absolute crap. I mean, first of all, you can see this is untrue. Hong Kong, right, is a barren rock. Yeah. There's nothing there, right? And it becomes this massive hub of trade because there's a different set of ideas were promulgated there than in the Gaza Strip, which is also not the world's most fertile area, but has no ideas that are being promulgated of any real economic worth. You can see it all over the earth. You can see on one side of a fence where ideas are changed, and the civilization is completely different. Everywhere from the Berlin Wall to go to the northern border of Israel, there's nothing more interesting. Go up to Rosh Hashanah at the very border, the top of Israel, and you stand at the top of Israel and you look back toward Israel, and it's all green and it's all fertile, and then you look across the border. I'm talking like 5 feet. Yeah. And there is nothing.
It's amazing.
And it's an amazing thing.
You know, we drove, I guess it's the West Bank that you drive to get to Masada.
Yeah.
And first of all, I kept asking all these Israelis. My wife wanted to go at night so we would get to Masada in the early morning, could climb it in the cool of the morning. And I kept saying to Israelis, is that dangerous driving? And of course, you can't get a straight answer from an Israeli. And
Well, the Israelis are like, nothing's dangerous. Nothing's dangerous. There's never been a dangerous thing in Israel.
They would say to me, like, why would it be dangerous? And I would say, well, what if I get a flat tire? The guy actually said to me, why would you get a flat tire? I said, I wouldn't do it on purpose.
So Israeli.
But I finally opted out. I chickened out and said, no, I want to go during the day because I just don't know what's there. We crossed that border and we were in the third world. We went from the first world to the third world in 50 feet. I mean, it was half a football field, and suddenly we were in the midst of this absolute destruction. And it's all ideas. They could adopt those ideas
There's
tomorrow.
There's an idea, by the way,
free.
in the Bible that is, I think, important to note here, and that's in an American context, is that the founders, in addition to having the right ideas based on reason, they also had gratitude in the face of those ideas. And what the left wants is to take away the idea of gratitude and replace it with the idea of covetousness. So people traditionally who came to this nation came because they knew that something better was possible here, and they wanted to touch that possibility. Unfortunately, the left now says that because it is geographic and race and conquest and all of these things that have allowed America to be prosperous, they say you should come here to get your piece of what was taken from you. It's all based in this sort of covetousness. But covetousness doesn't result in prosperity.
Right.
When people win the lottery, almost
go broke,
100% of the time they become broke. In the Bible, in Genesis, there's the story of Abimelech, right? And Abimelech fills in the wells of Abraham. He basically takes possession of the fruit of Abraham's labor.
Burns down the greenhouses in Gaza. Yeah.
And then we see it play out again 2,000 years, 3,500 years later in Gaza, when the Israelis give a piece of land to the Palestinians as a concession, and the Palestinians burn down all the greenhouses. They literally fill in the wells.
This is why I'm an imperialist. I'm an intellectual imperialist. I don't believe in imperialism by armies. I don't believe we should march on any bit, but I believe we should sell our ideas because they're the best ideas.
That's exactly how I feel, except I also believe in imperialism by armies and navies, but also ideas. Totally right. Yeah.
I want one more question from Elisha in what do we call it?
Subscribers.
That's a horrible name.
You made it up. Whatever.
Your branding capacity. We need to ask Trump. Trump's better brand.
We could use
I'm going to go to the smelly room of questioning.
But the question is, would he like my face or not? I don't know.
Oh, he'd love your face,
Oh,
Elisha.
thanks. Yeah. So this question is for Ben. It's from John, who's 17 years old, and he says that he lives in New York, and he's going to be a freshman going into
Who is well disliked by his peers. I mean, that's really the answer. Is there going to be certain people who actually want to talk ideas with you, and the people who want to talk ideas with you and have exchanges with you, these are going to be your lifelong friends. And there are a bunch of people that you want to hang out with because it's cool to go to parties with them, and maybe having the exchange is not worth it. You really do have to be utilitarian about the number of exchanges that you have. Now, as a person who, I'm more of a family person than a friends person, to be honest. Like, I'd much rather hang out with my family on any given night of the week than hang out with any of these people, particularly Michael Knowles. But it's
we thought we were your family.
No, you're not. It turns out, no. But I do think that if you are going to have friends, it is imperative to have a group of friends who actually think about these issues in a deep fashion. One of the great things about what we're doing here today is that this is actually how we sort of normally talk. We're this obnoxious. Like, we literally sit around talking about these things, right? We sit
That's
around
why we call it Daily Wire Backstage. People think that it's an
like we're
affect.
staging it and putting it.
This is actually what we do. This is my office.
Right, exactly.
We sit here. We do
Right,
this.
and so I think that when it comes to being popular, you can only do what you can do. People don't like you, they don't like you, and tough to them. But you can find a group of people who want to have good conversations and then treasure those people, because those people don't come along very often in your life, I think.
Yeah, and as the self-adopted mom of the Daily Wire office, I would just add that it's all quality over quantity.
Yeah, exactly. No,
I'll see you guys soon.
Thanks, Elisha. And if you want to get your questions in, this is our shameless self-promotion. Please become a subscriber at dailywire.com. Give us your lousy $10, as Andrew Klavan might say. We will give you all of this and more, plus the leftist tears, hot or cold, Daily Wire tumbler.
It's been automatically refilling lately.
Yes,
People-
My goodness.
Exactly. Never
that's right.
stopped. Never the bottomless.
That's right. What's in here is just water, but it is the sweetest water. So we've got people at home may be noticing, because they pick up on these things, that we have transitioned away
Yes.
from the incense incense of the Christian God.
That's right.
Fermented tobacco. By the way,
You guys are jerks. I mean, I'm just going to put this out there. So we've done how many of these now? This is our fourth one?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
I
Over a
hate
couple
cigar
years,
smoke.
yeah.
I really, I hate cigar smoke. I haven't, folks may have noticed, I don't smoke a cigar. Usually I've got my stupid bubble pipe, right? I don't do this thing. And so they come in here, they don't give a crap, right? They come in here and they smoke their cigars all the way down to the
Walking around the
nub.
office.
They breathe the smoke right in my face like I'm some sort of prisoner
I
of
would think
war.
it's good for
And then I hear that Jordan Peterson is coming in. And they're like, ooh, Jordan Peterson. I just pay your frickin' salaries. Right? You're like, oh, Jordan's coming in. Let's get the vapes.
Ben,
Okay, hello?
you should appreciate this more than anybody. Our guest is a doctor. Our guest is a doctor. We got to defer to the guy.
I get this letter all the time about how I can convert you to Christianity. They don't understand. We're torturing you until you convert.
I want to talk for a moment, and only a moment, about
Christianity. That's a good transition point.
what is moral about vaping and what is immoral about vaping.
Nothing, everything.
Well, I will say, I think that there is an immoral assault on fermented tobacco in this country, and that it's tied to the left's hatred of the founding, because tobacco drove the economy of the colonies at the time of the founding.
I'm not sure you want to go in this direction.
we were a
There were some other
tobacco
things that were
nation.
attached to tobacco.
nation.
They're not all that great.
The
Let's be real about
the
this.
early preachers who came over from Great Britain were paid in tobacco for their time.
Again, I'm not sure how deep you want to go here, dude. There were some other things associated with tobacco growing that were really kind of crappy.
But this is the poem. Tobacco is a dirty weed. I like it. It satisfies no normal need. I like it. It makes you thin. It makes you lean. It takes the hair right off your bean. It's the worst damn stuff I've ever seen. I like it.
Hey, that's very good. Bravo.
Wow.
I have to say, I've never vaped before.
Yeah.
But it's not bad.
No, it's all right. Yeah.
What is it? It's just water vapor?
It's just water vapor.
You just become a millennial when you do it. You just automatically you get a
Well,
man
Laban's
bun.
hair's
Who's
regrowing.
going to have a man
If you
bun?
hold it like this, it's no good. But if
Yeah,
you
it's
hold it
usually
like
like.
this,
I kind of
The
like.
one thing I do like about it, and is that the left is now trying to get rid of vaping too.
I know, yeah.
And they're trying to get rid of vaping because they just hate people and they hate humans pursuing happiness. They hate human
Why
joy.
is dope okay, but vaping is bad? I don't get it.
Yeah.
I don't even
Because
get
dope is
follow the line.
forbidden. Really, for the left,
And
so
because
much of
big
life
tobacco
is about.
drew.
Also,
Big
no, I really think that for the left, it really is about anything that is forbidden becomes a good.
But
For
then
the hard left.
But then doesn't this become a good when they forbid it?
No. They're allowed to forbid things, but anything
I
that was
see.
previously forbidden by culture is now not only good, it becomes necessitated. If you do not engage in it, you are now intolerant. You know how many times I've been at a party where somebody's been trying to get me to smoke pot, and I'm like, I won't even smoke a cigarette, and they're like, right, but that's different.
Yeah.
Like, why is that different? I'm so confused. Why is that
Has way
different?
more tar in it, right? Yeah.
That's right. I was attending a concert 10 years ago at an indoor venue here in LA, and people started passing around joints, And my wife got really offended by this because the whole place starts to smell, like pot. And she said, if I lit a cigarette, armed security would appear and remove me from this venue. But we're all supposed to accept that there's 20 joints getting passed around.
I think it's because drugs make you a slave. I think that's why they like them. They're willing. They like unbridled sex and drug use. That's the only thing liberals are liberal about.
It's a hell of a
And
pitch.
What's that?
It's a hell of a pitch. Let's be real.
But it does, like 2 months down the line, you're going to the government saying, "Please pay for my abortion. Please pay for my STD meds." It's like it makes you dependent. That's why they like it.
Well,
it's my theory.
It's a good theory.
I just made it up, but it's
Yeah. That's what I liked about it.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So before Jordan comes in, so you had mentioned a good patriotic scene in a movie.
Yeah.
So should we do favorite patriotic scene in a movie?
All right.
Okay,
Let's see.
so I have one that's really good.
All right, I have to
Okay,
think.
who here has seen The Best Years of Our Lives? Okay, so of course you're the only one who's seen it, of course. So for folks who haven't seen, Best Picture 1947, I believe. Best Years of Our Lives is a post-World War II film by William Wyler, who I think is the most underrated director of all time.
Great director.
He also did Ben-Hur.
yeah.
Just a bunch of fantastic films. Good case to be made that he's the best director of all time, just based on the number of great films that he made
a lot of good
in various different genres. There's the whole film is about a bunch of soldiers who are coming back from World War II, and one of them, it has so many great scenes. Harold Russell plays one of them. He's a guy who actually had no hands, so he has hooks for hands in the film. So he's a vet who's coming back with hooks for hands, and he's coming back to his high school sweetheart who hasn't seen the fact that he has no hands. And the question is she going to marry him knowing that now he's dependent on her? It's phenomenal. And there's one great scene. There are many great scenes in the film, but one of the best scenes is there's a scene where it has the most romantic scene also. There's a scene with him and the girl where he first shows her what life is going to be like when he takes off the hooks, and it's just spectacularly good. But there's another scene where he's basically working at a department store, and Dana Andrews is also another vet who's come back with him. And there's this guy who comes in, who's an America firster, like not like a Trump America firster, like a Charles Lindbergh America firster, right? Like a full-on isolationist. World War II is the wrong thing to do, like Pat Buchanan. World War II, we should have stayed out of it because we had nothing against Hitler. Hitler had nothing against us. And he comes in and he starts berating Harold Russell. Says, "What'd you lose your hands for? There's no purpose to losing your hands."
I remember this.
Like so many members of the left now, with all these vets who've come back from Iraq, saying, "Why'd you even bother to do that? You wasted your time." Or to Vietnam vets, "You wasted everything. Why would you bother engaging this?" And the guy's wearing a little American flag pin, and Harold Russell reaches over with his hook and pulls the American flag pin off the guy, and it's like. That's about right. That's about right. It's a great scene.
I don't think it compares, though, to the end of Dinesh D'Souza's Hillary's America. At the end of Dinesh D'Souza, whom we all love, at the end of Hillary's America, there is a sequence in which God Bless America segs directly into the Star-Spangled Banner as F-18s buzz the screen, fireworks explode, and Stephen Limbaugh plays rock and roll piano. And I think that if you didn't cry at that, then I don't even want to sit next to you at a monster truck rally.
It does make that scene in The Patriot, where Gibson shoves the flag through the guy's butt. It makes that look quite subtle by comparison.
Has anybody but me seen the film Not Without My Daughter?
No.
See, it's a good movie.
Really?
You will love this movie.
Okay,
this picture came out, say the 80s, 90s. This picture came out with Sally Field, true story.
Oh, I know that. Yeah, I know of the movie. I've never seen it, but I know it.
And it got hammered by the critics for political reasons. Vincent Canby, who was then the chief critic of the New York Times, later admitted that he hammered it for political reasons because it's the true story of a woman who marries a Muslim guy. She goes back with him to his country, which I can't remember which one it is, and then he turns into a monster. Yeah. And she's got to get out, but she can't leave without her daughter. And she goes through all kinds of hell to get out of this place. And the last scene, she steps across a line and she looks up and the flag unfurls, the American flag unfurls, and you weep. You just go like, that's what she was trying to get to. That's where we got to be. And that's a beautiful scene. And you will love this movie. You will thank me for telling you about this movie.
My favorite. I mean, I no joke. As we were talking about Dinesh, I was thinking about The Patriot. I do love it when that American flag goes right through them. The trouble is, as you say, there aren't really patriotic movies these days. No. The one, I guess I'll go back and defend Hail Caesar. There's this moment where George Clooney, playing this idiot left-wing actor, he says, Professor Marcuse says this, and the Marxists say, and we're not really doing anything. And what's the guy's name? Josh Brolin grabs him up and just starts slapping him. And he says, this studio's been good to you, and we go out there and we make a product which is artistic, and it's for America. And he says, okay, I'm sorry. And even that would have been great. That would have been a great scene about American capitalism and what the art that we export to the world. But then Clooney leaves dejected and he said, hey, stop. Go out there and be a star. And there's that American aspirational aspect too. Yeah. Go out there, listen, you idiot Hollywood actor. Go out there and do the best that you do. It's really an American scene.
And then he goes out and makes the movie, and it's about Jesus.
That's right.
And he delivers this beautiful speech, and then and can't remember the word he's supposed to go. The cute girl goes, faith.
Faith.
What is faith?
It's a great film.
Movie. I love that movie.
I probably just want to stand by Hillary's America, Dinesh's film. But I will say, even though it's a bit cliche, and we talk about it on every one of our episodes here, but the best movie ever made about America is Braveheart, in which Mel Gibson pretends that a bunch of Catholic Scotsmen in the 1300s are Protestant British subjects in America in the 1700s. I mean, it is a movie about this country. It's America. It's a movie about the ideals on which this country was founded, which do have roots in
The
Scotland.
Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, right?
Oh, that's one of my favorite
Right,
films.
which is great. If you haven't seen Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, folks, go out and see it. It's a spectacular film. And understand the metaphor of the man who has to use force in order to make room for the civilization that can grow. It's just, it's such a deep film that would never get made today in a million years.
When you were saying there were no more, to your point, when you were saying there were no more patriotic films, I was trying to think of a counterexample, and the first one that came into my mind was 300. Which is another one where they pretend that Sparta is America.
Right, when they weren't except for the killing babies at the beginning. Yeah, exactly. Well, I guess that is American, though, right? I mean, so I guess we're there. But
that's right. What are you? You're against killing babies now? What's wrong?
I know, I'm the worst. God. I'm like a Nazi. I'm against killing babies. It's just terrible.
You're like a Jew who puts other Jews on trains.
I've heard this.
I read that somewhere.
I don't remember where.
But it is truly amazing that if you ask people like where they get their patriotism now, I don't think that they get it from anywhere. I mean, like at least not in LA. I mean, having grown up my entire life here, if you ask people, the only time they look at the American flag, they're looking at it ironically, there's nothing more abhorrent than that.
And
like this is the flag that gave you your freedom. Like this right here represents the greatest country in the history of the world that gives you everything. And this is what I was noticing about all these socialists who grow up in capitalist splendor. I remember I was at some event. I was speaking at one of these colleges, and there was a socialist group handing out pamphlets beforehand. And so just for fun, I grabbed one of the pamphlets and I spent the first 10 minutes riffing on the pamphlet. And they had a series of quotes from all of these Americans who loved socialism. It was like Helen Keller was a socialist, and Martin Luther King was a socialist, and all these people. And I said, you know what all of them had in common? None of them had to live under a socialist regime. Right. Like, the fact that America is a free market country, which can only exist in the presence of a social fabric, this is the other thing. I think we all have to recognize that as much as the right now is focused very much on free markets and capitalism, which makes sense as opposed to the socialistic stupidity that the left is pushing. But without a social fabric and a level of virtue to back up the free market does degrade pretty quickly into something that involves exploitation for your own personal gain. That's why the founders all believe, Adam Smith believed this. I mean, read Adam Smith, he says the same thing. Everyone who is a founding father believed that if you didn't balance the pursuit of happiness with virtue, you were not going. There would be no happiness or virtue. It would all fall apart incredibly quickly.
Adam Smith was not an economist exactly. He was a moral philosopher.
Yeah, that's right.
You can't abstract this from its moral foundation.
That's been happening. That was happening to conservatism for a long time. I noticed this like 10 years, 15 years ago, where they were talking about capitalism as if it were in itself a good, rather than a system that, like all human systems, needs to be contained by the good.
Yeah, exactly. What you've seen, and it's really a problem, is you've seen the religious community in the conservative movement retreat into religiosity and sort of suggest that capitalism is cruel and terrible. And then you've seen the libertarian movement suggest that churches impose their values from above and they're intolerant and they're terrible, and if you bring up your kid in the church, it's because you're a fool. And I've said for a long time the only way the conservative movement survives in the long run is going to be if conservatives recognize that libertarians are right about government and libertarians recognize that conservatives are right about culture. That if we lack social fabric, then we're going to fall apart. And right now I'm much more worried about the social fabric falling apart than I think I am about the markets falling apart, just because the markets are so ensconced in every area of our life. I think that all of the pie-in-the-sky crap that is being pushed by Bernie Sanders and company, like, they fail to recognize that all of the Nordic socialist countries are not actually socialist countries. They're all built on the back of capitalism, then they try to redistribute the gains.
And they also live in our garage, basically. They use the things we invent. I always say, do they use cell phones? Do they use cars? Do they use computers? Then they're using the fruits of capitalism. And do they have an army that can defend them, or do they depend on us to defend them?
It's also true that Denmark ranks above us in economic freedom. I mean, in terms of just the amount of regulation, it's just that their tax rates are really high, which is terrible, and redistributionist. But that's not actually means of ownership of the means of production.
No, right.
You know, it's only the idiots among the socialists in America who talk about ownership of the means of production.
To really round out your point, the only way that the sort of economic policies of the left can become dominant is if we first lose the culture. Right. Politics is only able to function within the narrow confines defined by culture.
Well, this
is why Barack Obama had to be against gay marriage in order to be elected in 2008, and had to be for gay marriage in order to be elected in 2012. The culture moved the lines. Barack Obama didn't change anything.
This is a serious problem in terms of religion. I think that religion is the bottom rung of the Jenga tower, and I think that that is what the left always does. I mean, progress really is like Jenga, in that you pull out the parts that you don't need and you put them on top, and that's what you build on. But once you start pulling away those load-bearing walls, everything falls over. And I just think, we are at a moment when we actually need some people to make arguments about our religion that are fit for the modern age. I mean, I think that,
Good news, I wrote a book about it.
What's that?
And so did you. I wrote a book about it, and so did you.
Yes, we did, and we must. I mean, I think that's our job.
No, but I think I agree that that's the thing that has fallen apart the most, and that's been because of the malfeasance of churches. It's because of the malfeasance of synagogues. Religious leaders who have run away from the political fray. Yeah. They've made their religion less relevant to daily life. They've decided that religion has nothing to say about major issues in politics, that basically religion is there so that you can go there and hear somebody play guitar or say a few words about the Bible that have no actual relevance to anything beyond be a nice person, which you could get just from reading Aristotle. Yeah. And it's foolishness. I mean, the root of the religious community are certain basic principles that cannot be reasoned to. This is where people fail. Is I think that we've become the counter to the kind of anti-enlightenment that's happening right now, the movement away from reason, the passion movement, has been, as you said, this sort of Vulcan enlightenment where they say reason is the ultimate solution to everything. And the truth is, reason is not the ultimate solution to everything. People can reason themselves into pretty much anything. And we just saw that over the course, the worst things, right? Most of the first half of the 20th century was about people reasoning themselves into the belief that mass murder was okay, or that full state ownership of everything resulting in mass murder was okay. Reason doesn't take you the whole way. You have to have the right premises in order to reach the right conclusion. So for me, religion provides certain basic premises, and then you can reason from those premises to the correct conclusions.
Right.
But if you don't...
When the left makes statements and the Whore of Babylon, Oprah.
Yes, our future president. The Whore of Babylon.
She stated this explicitly during the 2008 election when she said, basically that for America to ascend, all the old white guys have to die. Like it's always baked into the leftist calculation that people have to die in mass in order for these ideas to be, because they want to purge all the sort of ideas that they've objected to. They don't find wisdom in the past. They don't ever look back. One of the alarming things that I found as I talk to millennials is how little they know about anything that happened before them.
Right. Yeah.
And because we have a certain conceit, because we have cell phones that are connected to the internet wirelessly, any fact, any piece of data that exists anywhere on Earth can be in your hand in mere seconds.
You need discipline to read them.
Yeah, but it causes us to think that we're the most advanced people who've ever lived. We're not. We're the most technologically advanced people.
We were born on third
lived.
base and we think we hit a triple.
That's Steven Pinker's big mistake, is he thinks that technological advancement and scientific advancement is advancement, and it is really the illusion of advancement.
That's right.
It's a wonderful thing, and don't get me wrong, we all love it, but it is based on the society that built it. It didn't break away.
Right. What they think is that
like
that basically it was a scaffold. That religion was a scaffold to build the tower, and
yes,
then after the tower was built, then you can remove the scaffold, and the thing won't fall down.
Yeah.
And it's all foundational. These foundational principles, like even things as basic as free will, responsibility. These things are not. You can't reason your way to free will.
Right.
You can't.
You're right.
I mean, the reality is that
you can reason yourself out of it.
Well, this is what Sam Harris does,
That's
right? I mean, I
right,
had him on for an hour, and I love Sam. I mean, Sam's a really nice guy and a good guy, and I have lots of fun talking to him. But Sam bases his entire political worldview, in my view, on the idea that we do have free will, but he wrote an entire book about how we don't have free will.
Yeah.
And so I said to him, okay, so why are we even sitting here? Like, what's the point of this conversation? And he says reason is the most valuable thing. I totally agree, reason is supremely valuable, but if you are a base materialist and you believe that basically we are just a conglomeration of atoms in a certain configuration, then what difference does it make which neuron is firing to which neuron? Why is that superior in any moral way?
But reason is not the most valuable thing. Because reason, as we understand it, is a fairly new construct. And look, so are many of the things that I love, from this vape pen, which I now love, can't get enough of it, to my cell phone, to the air conditioning in this building, to light. I mean, I love the products that reason has given us.
Sure.
But to imply that reason is the highest good is to basically suggest that no one who lived before this sliver of a moment in which we live experienced fulfillment. And the truth is, many people found more fulfillment before the age of reason.
I agree that reason's. You were talking about the French Revolution, and they did worship reason. I mean,
they literally had a god of reason.
The god of reason.
They took over Notre Dame, and
it's funny in all these Enlightenment books. They're always attacking the Romantics, who are my favorites. I like the fact that we have Percy Shelley over there, one of the worst human beings who ever wrote great poetry. But one of the things about the Romantics is they saw the French Revolution, and everybody says, oh, they were against the Enlightenment. No, they were against slaughtering people en masse. They were against World War, which came out of the French Revolution. And they said, we lost something here, and they went back and tried to find it. Many of them went back and tried to find it without God, which didn't work out too well, but at least they were looking in the right place, that there is something. I mean, after all, beauty and truth, those two pillars of our lives, they don't actually come from reason. They start, as you say, with axioms, and then we reason from those axioms.
People who lived 3,500 years ago were people.
Yeah, but they also had reason, right?
Well, they had a kind of reason, but they don't have the reason that people now worship. Reason was
science.
They don't have scientific reason yet. And where they found most of their contentment at that time was in the same places that people find their contentment today. That's the point that I'm making, that people haven't changed. Society has changed. People are people.
But modern reason, I think, actually is an outgrowth of religion. I mean, just historically speaking, the modern reason, the scientific method, the idea that you're supposed to investigate the cosmos, so that you can, that came from an idea you're supposed to investigate the cosmos to know God better.
Right.
I mean, it's a very Thomistic idea, right?
It's a Thomistic idea.
It's Maimonides' idea, right? It is actually it's actually an Islamic idea at that time, right? Preceding all of that, you actually have people like Al-Farabi who are actually making the same case in the Islamic world before Islam clamps down, and then you have basically 1,000 years of stagnation in terms of scientific discovery in the Islamic world. Reason was a human possibility that was universal, but the development of reason in a specific way is the outgrowth of a Judeo-Christian civilization, and all of that's spread to other places and grafted onto other cultures. Cannot hide the fact that scientific development was almost purely a Western phenomenon post-13th century.
Yep.
That if you look at the development of science and the development of reason in the last 800 years, nearly all of it is happening in the West.
The guy who
which is why gunpowder in China meant nothing, but as soon as it got to the West, suddenly people realized we can fire this crap at each other.
The pursuit of happiness.
The guy who discovered the Big Bang was not just it's not just that he believed in God. He was a Catholic priest, George Lemaitre, Isaac Newton,
Gregor Mendel.
Mendel, right? Yeah, Mendel, Isaac Newton spent decades interpreting Scripture. It is when these guys come to me, the kind of modern atheist types, and they say, "Oh, we don't have free will. Oh, I've reasoned, I've understood that we don't have free will." My response is, I start punching them. I punch them because they say, "Stop punching me." I say, "Oh no, I'm not punching you. I'm not punching you. I'm not morally culpable. I'm not doing anything." It's such a sad and shallow abdication of every foundation that brought you to that point of the age of reason. I talked to this guy in the show last week. We had that North Korean defector. We're going to air it this week. Ji Song-ho, the guy with the crutches at the stadium. He was the most heroic person I'll ever meet probably in my life. And he had crossed into China to beg. He was begging though, he wasn't running away yet. And he encountered a Christian missionary. And he just thought North Korean life, lying on the floor for days at a time, not just so you don't starve to death by wasting energy. He thought that was the way of life. He met this Christian missionary, and he said at that moment he realized that all human beings long for freedom. He realized that there's something that touches the human soul right at its core to make you long for freedom. And it's just as we were talking about, that foundation within that construct of this culture that we can reason to, we can be revealed, that stirs the human heart to freedom.
This is why it's so frustrating when people who don't read the Bible start ripping on the Bible about this stuff. Like really, people who have never read more than the couple of verses out of context that Richard Dawkins quotes in his books, right? Where it's like they don't bother to read the part where God specifically says, right, you have a choice here between life and death, choose life, right? These areas of agency, these areas of, you're supposed to, the idea that the word is, I'm more familiar with the Old Testament, obviously, for obvious reasons, but the area where it says that it's not in heaven, right? It's here. It's for you to understand. Right? This idea is rooted in biblical thought, which is why, at least in Judaic thought, we have volume upon volume of people arguing with each other about how to interpret this stuff. Because my view of religion is that God gave a revelation, but he gave it to human beings who were capable of reason for a reason. He gave it to us because our job is to try and understand what the hell God was saying to us. And if we don't do that, then it's just as bad as no revelation at all. Revelation is given to a specific set of people at a specific set of time with knowledge of how people operate. God knows all of that stuff. And so the way that I sort of see the Bible, the way I see religion, is that we are a set of chemicals, and God puts the catalyst in the brew. And once the catalyst is in the brew, then things start building.
Almost as though he formed us and then breathed life into us.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I see where you're going with that.
Weirdly like
well,
that.
which I mean, even in the language of the original Hebrew language, right? When it's talking about God breathing ruach into people, ruach is wind and spirit, right? So that the idea is that it is that life force that gives it that's what makes us unique. Right, it's that life force that makes us unique, as opposed to the animals, and that comes along with certain privileges and certain responsibilities.
And one of our favorite books, Poetic Diction, talks about the fact that when they originally used those words, it wasn't two meanings.
Right.
It was the meaning. It was breath and spirit, which is a wonderful idea, because it actually does takes you to where you got to be. I mean, that's the thing that civilization loses.
The image of the Trinity that you get from Genesis is Christ is the Word, God the Father calls forth the word, and his breath is the ruach, is the spirit. And the Catholic Thomistic understanding is that the Holy Spirit is the bond of love between the Father and the Son. You get this perfect picture of this logical universe, because God is the logic of the universe. And from that you get the natural law, and you get the natural rights that are enshrined in a in the political document that started the country.
And I can't think of another religion. I'm probably going to make a fool of myself here, but I've read most of the holy books, and I can't think of another religion that puts so much emphasis on the word, that God said, let there be light, and there was light, and
Pastafarianism. That's the one. But other than that one, the worship of pasta. That's my religion.
I'm not familiar with this delicious religion, but I would like to learn more.
Sounds good, doesn't it? Yeah.
But that's why, like, our country is based on words. This is why when you see people, it's the idea that human existence is based on words, right? That what matters most in our lives is based on words. Yeah. And then what the left says is, no, you're based on material. You're based on things. Words don't mean anything. And all the shortcomings in your life, this is based on lack of material privilege. What gives your life meaning is the words, whether it's you saying I love you to your spouse, or whether it is the words that came down from Sinai. It's words and our interactions with each other and our interactions with something beyond ourselves that actually matters.
Even predating Christianity, though, the Egyptians believed that words had magic and that the spoken word created something in the universe. This is why they built giant temples to themselves after they died, because they believed that you died a second time when people stopped speaking your name aloud. There is power in the spoken word because it communicates the ideas in which humans find their meaning.
Somebody left.
Speaking of mythology.
Speaking of mythology, it is now time to welcome our very special guest. He is a clinical psychologist, a professor, and author of the best-selling 12 Rules for Life, an Antidote to Chaos. Even more interestingly, given tonight's subject matter, he hails from a nation, not America, located, as best I can recall, somewhere to the general north of us, a land whose chief exports are comedians and healthcare refugees, a land best known as George Washington's greatest mistake. Yes, I am talking about Canada. Please welcome Dr. Jordan Peterson.
Welcome.
That's a hell of an introduction. See, you guys got all warmed up.
Dr. Peterson, we're talking about human freedom. Have you ever considered that if George Washington had just marched north, Americans would have invented Tim Hortons, and you wouldn't have to put your Lady King oppressor on your coinage to this very day?
Yeah, you guys tried that in 1812 and got stomped pretty bad for it. I think we burned down the White House, if I remember correctly.
President Trump will take his revenge.
Yeah. That's fair. Welcome. Thank you for sitting down with us.
My pleasure. Pleasure.
We're talking about just random crap that matters to us. It started talking about human freedom.
And now we're talking religion, actually.
And now we're talking religion.
Yes, well, I heard you making some comments about Egyptian theology when I just sat down, and so...
You know far more than any of us on
Well,
this
it is the case that the Egyptians had an idea that the world was created as a consequence of the use of language, the word, right? And so the Judeo-Christian doctrine of the word seems to have some of its historical grounding in the ancient Egyptian conceptions. And the Egyptians were actually concerned not only with language, like the Mesopotamians, by the way, because their god Marduk, who conquered chaos to generate the world out of the pieces of chaos. It was chaos in monstrous form of another goddess named Tiamat. He used magic words to defeat her, and also attention. He was a god of attention. He had eyes all the way around his head. So both the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians were very much concerned not only with linguistic ability, but also with the capacity to pay attention, which I think is extremely interesting because it's different than thinking. It's something different than reason as well, because attention precedes reason. And attention is actually something that's also dependent on the structure of your values. And so the Mesopotamians and the Egyptians had figured out that it was something like the combination of attention and language that generated the habitable world. It's a really deep idea. I've kind of tracked that through the Old Testament too, and one of the things that I found absolutely fascinating about the opening sentence of Genesis is there's an idea that God uses language, logos, fundamentally, to extract out habitable order from chaos and potential. That's the basic idea. Then, of course, every time he does that, day by day, so to speak, he says that it's good. And so there's a really profound idea in there, an unbelievably profound idea, which is that not only does linguistic ability and the word transform chaos and potential into habitable order, but if it's truthful speech, then the habitable order that emerges is good. It's an ethical axiom. We were talking about axioms a little bit earlier. And so the axiom, the fundamental axiom that opens up the Old Testament is something like the being that's brought into being as a consequence of truthful speech is by definition good. It's an axiomatic statement, and it's so interesting, and it's such a brilliant, it's an absolutely brilliant idea. Because
it's kind of what you believe when you have faith, is that you believe that creation is good, which is against all odds and against even what you can see with your eyes and suffer with your
well, then
flesh.
there's also a manner of participating in it that's good.
Well,
That's the thing that's so
true.
interesting, and that's your ethical obligation. And it's also something that's
Which,
like
by the way, precedes the exile, right? Everybody thinks that tilling the land, right, that our obligation to work happens after the exile from Eden. The first obligation of man is to cultivate and till the garden before they leave the garden. So the question is, why are they cultivating and tilling the garden when the garden is perfect, supposedly?
Well, it's also before that the statement is made that they're made in the image of God. It's not obvious what that means at that point. But if God, at least in part, the way that's laid out, is the structure that uses linguistic communication to give rise to being, that's the basic narrative, then the fact that people are made in that image is the idea that we continue that process.
Which is why they start naming the animals, right?
Right, that's exactly
The
right.
first action of man is to start using his own language.
Yeah, the animals don't exist in some sense till they're named. You know, just like things don't exist in some sense till they're named. Like, I mean, it's complicated.
In Jewish theology, it's the same thing, by the way, is that you're actually not supposed to name the baby until the Brit Day, until there's a Brit Milah. So with our son, we didn't name him formally until the day of his Brit Milah, because the idea is that he has not been fully invested almost as, like, he's a human being, but he hasn't been fully invested as a capable human being in a certain sense until we actually name him on the day that he is entered into the covenant. Once he enters into the covenant, then that's when you give him the name. Like, you literally do it simultaneous with that.
Well, words do call things into reality, you know, in some sense that we don't really understand. Otherwise, we wouldn't think, because what you're doing when you're thinking is it's the precursor in some sense to transforming potential into actuality. So one of the ways that I've been, and this is an alternative to thinking in a deterministic way, is that what we see in front of us is a landscape of possibility. That's what we face. And and we have a range of choices within that landscape of possibility. They're not unbounded because we're not omniscient or omnipotent, right? So they're not unbounded, but it's a wide range of choices. And we determine which of those potentialities will manifest themselves will manifest themselves in reality. And we do that, first of all, by thinking, because that helps us plot our course. We do that with words.
But we think with words.
That's right.
Well, that's right. We think with
Charles
words.
Krauthammer talks about this, actually. Another clinical psychologist. He said that he learned psychiatrist, that's right.
They're almost as good. a little druggy for my taste.
That's true. He's very useful, you know. But he said this early on in punditry. He realized that by naming something, he imbued his piece with great power. So as a psychiatrist, he identified some disorder, and this was a disorder that people had known about, you know, but he gave a name to it. And now every year a dozen people are diagnosed with this disorder. And famously in the 80s, he diagnosed the Reagan Doctrine. And there was a little advocacy here too. He was observing some things, but he also wanted to push the White House in that direction. And he said by giving the name, the Reagan Doctrine, he in a sense created the Reagan Doctrine.
I made a trip down to Costa Rica with some friends probably 12 years ago now. And, you know, we're all looking at the things that we're going to do, go zip lining or go whitewater rafting. I somehow found a book about the exotic birds of Costa Rica. And, you know, you're on a long bus ride, so I'm thumbing through this book and learning the names of certain birds. As a result, I saw all of the birds while we were on the trip. No one else saw any of the birds. I would ask them, you know, did you see this? Did you see that?
Yeah,
they didn't.
There's an aspect of, and that goes along with that issue of attention. There's an aspect that's something like a bringing into focus, right? And it's a definition of what's there and what's not there at the same time. But and so obviously, in some sense, the birds were there, although they weren't there for you. But they blended into everything else. And that which blends into everything else is not really there in some sense. It's not there till it stands out against the background. So there is the background, whatever that is. Well, that's that potential in some sense. But it doesn't attain its full reality until it's carved out of the background.
But all of my friends apparently read books on how to sleep with beautiful women. Oh, yeah. Their experience in Costa Rica was much different.
Well, you got the birds.
But this is why inherited wisdom matters so much, because if you don't have inherited wisdom, you don't even know what you're looking for. Right, this is that famous psychological study where they have the person they have two people in the foreground who are throwing a basketball to one another, okay, and they say, you know, how many times is this person throwing the basketball to this other person, and then in the background they actually have a person dressed in a gorilla suit walking around for a solid 10-15 seconds,
it's right
in front, right,
yeah,
and they ask people how many times. If you were keeping track of how many times the ball was thrown, then you knew how many times the ball was thrown. Then say, well, what about the gorilla? And people are like, well, what gorilla? But as soon as you tell people there was a gorilla in the video, they know there was a gorilla.
Yes, well, one of the things that I've been discussing with the people that I've been talking to on this tour, all these the people in the audience, is the fact that this is something that's absolutely beyond belief, that neuroscience has converged on this as an idea, and it's partly as a consequence of these studies, although there's way more information than that's pushing this vision. Not only do you carve out what's real as a consequence of your words, but you see the world through your value system. And it's like, well, no, the world's there without your value system. It's like, no, you don't get it. Is the things that announce themselves to your perception. So the things that announce themselves to you as even more fundamental than facts, right? Because I think objects are even more fundamental than facts, is conditioned to a degree that's almost inexpressible by your value system. One of the propositions that I've been putting forward to my audience is, look, if the world isn't manifesting itself to you in a manner that you find tolerable, and so you're bitter and resentful about that, and maybe you have your reasons to be that because life is very difficult, it's possible that you're aiming at the wrong things. It's like it's a presupposition that's worth investigating, because it does seem that you carve out figure from ground as a consequence of imposing a value system on this plethora, the infinite plethora of potential facts. And so if all that's doing is leading you to a position that isn't commensurate with the sort of life that you'd even like to bear, then you think, maybe my value system is not oriented properly. One of the things that's really interesting about the Old Testament, one of the things that makes it such a stupendous moral document, is that every time the ancient Hebrews, they get flattened by God all the time. Like, it's just, they build up an empire and they get flattened, and they build up an empire and they get flattened. And you know, it's often because there's a prophet emerges and says, you guys have deviated from the divine path, and so you're going to get walloped, and no one listens, or sometimes they do, and then they get walloped. But one of the things that really marks out the ancient Hebrews is every time they get walloped, they say, we must have made a mistake. Right? There's no victimization culture there, so to speak. It's like, if we're being flattened, it's because we're stupid and wrong. And you think, well, is that a pessimistic or an optimistic statement? It's like, well, if you're stupid and wrong, you might be able to do something about it. Right. But if the world's stupid and wrong...
But it's interesting. This is exactly the point that so many of the new scientific pro-Enlightenment writers find almost comical. One of them compared it to Monty Python, that they should find a proof of God in their disasters. That instead of, but in fact, it's an incredibly useful idea that it's your mistake. It's not God's mistake. It's your mistake.
Well, it's an open question, anyways. Right?
Yeah,
it's
to be asked.
You say, well, look, like the world is predicated on suffering, and it's got an overlay of malevolence. It's like, there's no doubt about that.
Sure.
And so then the question is, well, where's the fault? And the answer to that is, well, you can't figure it out until you rectify your own faults.
But what does the prophet always do? He points them back to the words.
Right.
He points them back to those original ideas. And I think that, you know, to sort of pull this back to our 4th of July and also Canada Day.
Wherever that is.
And our Canada Day conversation is, you know, what is special about the words on which this nation, and maybe to a broader extent the West as we understand it, what are the words, what are the ideas that brought us here? How can we help point people back to those ideas for their own, for selfish interest, obviously, because I think our world is a better place, but for their interest too. You know, we live in a world where we see such unhappy people, suicide on the rise.
So one of the things, I've been watching what really stops the crowds in their tracks and makes them dead silent, eh? And there's a couple of things that I've been talking about that do that, but one of the most effective rhetorical devices, let's say, or topics is probably better, is to talk about responsibility. And so, like, responsibility is often something that's finger waved at you. You know, you should be a good person. But I've been setting forward a set of propositions to the audience, and the first proposition is the one we discussed a bit ago, that there is an element of existence that's suffering, that's compounded by malevolence, that's sort of ineradicable, you know, and it's the sort of thing that makes people wonder whether their own lives are worthwhile or whether life is even worthwhile. And that's the fundamental issue. That's the suffering and the malevolence that's part of life. It's like, okay, well, you need something to contend with that, to contend against that, because you're not going to overcome it. But it doesn't seem like you're going to overcome it. What helps you contend with it? So you need something to get yourself out of bed on a terrible day, so you can move forward. And the answer to that almost invariably is, weirdly enough, it's responsibility. It's like, who the hell would have guessed that? It's like, well, you need something meaningful, because you set the meaning against the tragedy and the suffering and the malevolence. So that's okay, this is terrible, but I have something meaningful to do. Okay, where do you find what's meaningful? Well, who do you admire? Well, you admire people that can take care of themselves. and you admire people who take care of other people as well as themselves. And maybe you really admire people who can also do some good in the community while they're taking care of themselves and their family, right? So the heavier burden they're bearing, the more respectable and admirable they are. It's like, oh, isn't that interesting? The meaning that helps you stay, the meaning that helps you contend with life without becoming embittered and cynical and vengeful and all those terrible things is to be found in adopting as much responsibility as you can. And it isn't obvious that people, for a while at least, have made that connection between responsibility and meaning. And that's a way better argument than you should be responsible.
But I want to ask a question, because I'm right in the middle of your book, which I'm enjoying immensely, by the way. And you often talk, because you're a clinical psychologist, you often talk in very practical terms about the things that work, the things that make life better. And yet, I have found that people who can't make sense of even the most practical ideas, if they don't have an underlying sense, they can't follow those ideas through.
Right.
And
That's why you have to get up to the abstractions as
exactly.
well. Right?
You have to get up to the abstractions, but the abstractions require a certain amount of faith. They require a certain amount of faith, for instance, that the logos is good, that the good is better than the chaos. Where do you direct people's faith? Because I'm a little confused about it. I hear you kind of speaking in sort of Jungian ideas, that there's that these gods are kind of, are they within us? Is this a model within the collective unconscious, or do you believe there is something out there that we are responsible
Depends
to?
what you mean by out there.
Well, I mean,
no, but I really
Not
mean
out
that. It's like, well, what do you mean? Do you mean out there in space? Doesn't look like it. We've gone a long ways out there. It's about 13.5 billion light years now.
Is there something other than space and time in which, on which this world is supported?
Good question.
Thanks.
I mean, how to answer that? I've had experiences that I can't describe that would suggest that. For me personally, I don't know what that would mean universally. Well, I think we may have. I mean, but. And I don't know about that. I mean, the reason that I've tried to stay within the psychological or even the biological domain in my discussions of religion is because that's an area that I have some expertise in. And I do think that you can track the evolution of religious ideas to way down. And so there's a hierarchy of values, and whatever's at the top of the hierarchy of values is in some sense de facto God. What happened with, because it's the thing that you're serving, it's the thing to which you give obeisance.
But even for there to be a hierarchy of values, doesn't there have to be something above the values themselves to which those values tend?
I think that you could say yes. I think the highest value in the hierarchy isn't exactly a value. It's the process by which values are generated.
Okay.
It's a strange thing. You know, the thing is if you think about the Christian symbolic universe psychologically, you have something at the pinnacle, and the pinnacle is Christ, whatever Christ represents, and the Christ is the King of Kings. And that actually means something from an abstraction perspective. It's like, well, if you took a lot of people who deserve to be king because of their positive qualities, let's say, they actually embody a valid sovereignty. And so you have a dozen kings, and they're all great kings, and then you distill out of them what makes them great as kings. What you distill out of that is that symbolic image. Right. And that actually started to happen long before Christianity. You saw it in the ancient Egyptian representations of Horus and Osiris, for example, because the pharaoh, the Egyptian pharaoh, was actually the embodiment of the conjunction of Horus and Osiris. And so the Egyptians were trying to puzzle this out in their imagistic way. And in Mesopotamia, the god Marduk, who I already talked about, who was magic words and attention, he had eyes all the way around his head, like Horus, because Horus, the Egyptian god, was an eye who could pay attention, right? The famous eye, pay attention. And people were already trying to work out imagine that each tribe had its god. And then all the tribes got together, and then the gods had a war, because how else do you settle which tribe god is going to win? And so there was a conflict of gods, abstractions across huge spans of time, thousands and thousands of years, and the gods organized themselves into a hierarchy. And some god came out on top. It was Marduk in the Mesopotamian case, and the Mesopotamians figured out, well, which god should be the top god? Oh, the god of magic words, the god that pays attention, the god that confronts chaos and makes habitable order. It's like, hey, that's not bad. That's a principle of sovereignty. It's also a principle of divinity. It's also the hallmark of the soul. And you can lay all that out, both biologically and evolutionarily. And then the question emerges, well, is there something other than that? Like, does that point to something else? And this, I don't know about this. This is this is where our knowledge sort of ends. But here's an idea. It's sort of a lateral idea. So imagine that there's the idea of God the Father. What might that be? Well, here's how human sexual selection works, as far as I can tell. And this is what separated us from chimpanzees, by the way, over
It
evolutionary
separated me
time.
from my friends in Costa Rica. That's what
So all the men get together, and they're doing something useful. And all the men vote on who the most useful man is at doing that useful thing. Okay, and so he gets to go up to the top of the hierarchy. Well, then you could imagine the man who's most useful across multiple hierarchies. That's even a better ideal, but we'll stick with one hierarchy. The men all get together and they vote on who's the best man. So it's like the spirit of man votes on the best man. That's who the women sleep with. Right, right. So it's so interesting, because what happens is we get together with our consciousness of what it means to be human, and we vote on who's superior among us, and we promote them to mating status, and the women peel from the top. And that is how it works. So then you might say, well, people think, well, evolution is a random process. You kind of hear that. No serious biologists believe that, because it's not random. The generation of mutations, the generation of variation is random, possibly, at least quasi-random, but the selection mechanism, that's bloody well not random. It's not random at all. And something's been driving it for a long time. And insofar as human beings have hierarchies of value, and insofar as you dominate the hierarchy of value, you're in a better position to reproduce, which you certainly are, especially if you're male. Then the hierarchy of value determines reproductive success. So then you have the action of a discriminatory consciousness across an extended expanse of time that's actually driving human evolution. It's like, well, how closely associated is that with God? Well, I don't know. Does the literal and the metaphorical touch at that point?
Well, that's the question. Because the discriminatory consciousness separates the heavens from the earth, it separates the birds from the fish, but does, at the end of that hierarchy and at the top of those values and that thing which creates the values, does it become incarnate and live for 30 years and die for your sins, for instance, or some other
It's worth
version?
noting, especially in the context of today's conversation, that the West isn't just premised on ancient ideas of gods. It's premised very specifically on the idea of one God, of the God of monotheism. That the polytheistic world didn't invent modernity. The monotheistic world invented modernity, and in some ways began inventing modernity from the moment of its inception. God speaks to Abraham, and the world as we sort of understand it puts itself in motion.
Well, there's a parallel too between the development of monotheism and psychological integration. Like if you're not aimed at one thing, let's say, so you don't have a highest value, so you don't have a monotheistic God, that's one way of looking at it, then you're a house divided amongst itself. You're weak, because you're pulling yourself in more than one direction. And if you're pulling yourself in more than one direction, then it's easy to stop you. Maybe you're pulling yourself in 10 directions. I mean, that's what happens when you're in a state of confusion. You can't be oriented according to one value, so you can't act in the world. The question is, well, the real question is, what should be the ultimate value that orients you? And I think the religious systems, the great religious systems, have been trying to lay that out in image and story. What should be the highest value? And it's something like, in Christianity, it's something like that which dies and can be reborn, right? It's that which internally renews itself. It's also the logos. It's the word that extracts chaos out of order. It's the thing that's embodied as the King of Kings. And what's interesting about it, and also psychologically sophisticated, which makes it something other than just reason, is that it's embodied. Because reason is kind of a disembodied thing. You know, it's the sort of thing that maybe you could gerrymander with artificial intelligence, although that didn't work very well, because even AI systems have to be embodied. You can't separate out the reason from the embodiment, and that's partly why you get that emphasis in Christianity, is the word has to be made flesh.
But it's worth noting that
it's
worth noting that in both Judaism and Christianity, which emerges out of Judaism, that the one God isn't identified with one value. The one God is identified with a series of values, with a series of virtues, with the fruits of the Spirit from a Christian point of view. That God is love, but God is also justice. That God is mercy, but He is also judgment. That God is the thing in which we hope.
Yeah.
He's
the hypothetical transcendent ideal from which all those things
from all the other ideals
right? And
flow.
so you
That's
can't
right.
be encapsulated in a single value.
Right.
It's very difficult.
It's also, you were talking about metaphor before. You're also talking about the direction of the flow of meaning, because there is a huge push now to tell us that everything means the flesh. everything is the meaning, the ultimate meaning. I mean, that's kind of where Freud was trying to go.
Love is really just a chemical.
It's a series of chemicals. But the whole thing about Christianity, when you say that the truth has
but
to
we
be...
we don't understand chemicals very well.
But we don't need to know that too.
That's the big problem. It's like, we can reduce your thoughts to my theory of what a chemical is.
But the whole point about an embodied God is that he embodies something. He is embodying something, a logos that is not embodied. And it suggests that all metaphors go in the other direction, that all metaphors are traveling upward, that the flesh itself is a language that God is speaking through, and that we are a language that
and
God is
that we are
speaking
more
through.
than flesh.
And that we are more than flesh. And we at least represent something more than flesh.
I've often, and I know this is not an original thought, but I tend to think that all of the physical world is a metaphor for something more important playing out at a level that we can't really perceive. That basically God gave us this as a ground, rooted us in something that our little monkey brains could conceive.
Yeah, I think we
to
even
represent something
perceive
much
it. I
bigger
just
happening.
don't think we notice. I think people
I agree
perceive
with
it all
that.
the
Yeah,
time
yeah,
because,
that's right.
like, my psychological analysis, let's say, has led me to observe that we do inhabit a world of order and chaos, and we understand that. It's the basis for most of our narratives, even though we can't say it, we can't articulate it, but it's embedded in the narratives, and everyone understands it because they go watch the narratives and it makes sense. So that's the background order, is order and chaos, and then on top of that, there's a template of good and evil. And so I think we do see the cosmos as a eternal battleground between good and evil on a background of order versus chaos. I actually think that's the reality to which our brains are adapted to too, which is quite interesting because there's a good line of neuropsychological speculation, but it's deep. It's decades old, and it's come from all sorts of places. That your right hemisphere is basically specialized for something like chaos, and your left hemisphere is specialized for something like order. And that's a rough one, man. It's like, oh, look at that. You have a bifurcated hemisphere, or hemispheres. Why is that? Well, because adaptation has called that forth. Well, isn't the thing that calls forth the adaptation the world? Well, yes. Well, then isn't the world chaos and order? Oh, well, it looks like it is. And then another thing that comes out of that that's so incredibly interesting is that your sense of orienting meaning emerges as a consequence of the dynamic interplay of the hemispheres. And so you get a sense of the meaning that orients you as a consequence of the neurological interplay between systems designed for chaos and systems designed for order. And this has been really useful to me because, people tend to think, like they think human beings are the epiphenomena of chemicals, that meaning is an epiphenomena on some more fundamental substrate. And I think, well, wait a second, meaning is actually it's the highest instinct of orientation that you actually have to actually live in the world. It's actually the most reliable reality. It's maybe more reliable. Well, you can't orient yourself if you're a materialist because you can't derive values from facts, not so easily. But you can orient yourself as a consequence of the manifestation of meaning. It's like, well, what's meaning? Well, maybe it's the most real thing. It's like, maybe it actually is the most real thing.
The very fact that you can tell a parable, a story about physical beings interacting and get meaning from it, indicates to me that we are oriented toward meaning.
A computer knows the parable but doesn't know what it
can't know
means.
the-
Elisha.
Oh, sorry.
It is essential when we do Daily Wire Backstage that we let other people ask questions and we don't just sit here and ask each other questions the entire time. Specifically our subscribers, because they have paid for the privilege by sacrificing the fruit of their labors at a rate of $10 a month so that they can participate. Elisha in Subscription Central, what have you for us?
Oh, I just find it really interesting that you guys are copying my vape from the Father's Day special, but I guess you didn't get the memo that the cool kids aren't doing that anymore.
What's the new thing? Is it meth or something? I don't know. We shouldn't do that. That seems like a bad idea.
I think that our cool factor always lags Elisha by about 15 days.
Thank you.
Well, you're
so
all
too.
conservative. You're not supposed to be
That's
too
right.
cool.
We're not that cool. Yeah.
At least we're not like the city of Santa Monica that just banned them all before they, anyway. They're allowed still here at the Daily Wire offices. Welcome, Dr. Peterson. We'll have some questions for you in a little bit. But first, Dylan asks everyone on the panel. He says that he believes that America is the greatest country on earth because of its ideas, and he thinks it's pretty obvious. So why aren't more countries trying to emulate our values? Canada.
Ben, what do you have?
I mean, countries all over the world are striving to emulate American values, and I would say Western values more broadly, at a rate that's absolutely beyond comprehension on our historical grounds. And we see right now that things are getting better everywhere quite rapidly, to the degree that those ideas are being instantiated. And the fundamental idea, I think, is the idea of the sovereignty of the individual. It's individual. It's where your fundamental value is located. It's either the group or the individual. That's it. Now the group is also there, obviously, and to the degree that countries are instantiating those values in their economic systems, they're doing not only quite well by historical standards, but getting better really fast. So.
This is where I think there is a bifurcation in the world right now. I think there are developing nations that are looking at the United States and saying, why don't we do some of that, and that will make us a lot stronger and a lot better. And then there are developed nations that are looking at the United States and they're saying, look at all these crazy religious kooks who live across the water and believe in these things like it's a two-party system, and they don't believe in tremendous redistributionism.
They go to church.
And they go to church a lot, and we should not do that. And they're failing accordingly. But I think that there is an attempt to run away from certain American founding values, specifically because those founding values are predicated on some of the deep stuff that we're talking about here. People are afraid of that stuff. People
should be.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that they should be, because it actually comes along with obligations that do not attend on a certain materialism. And this is particularly true in Europe, where it seems like they're redistributing the fruits of the last several hundred years of Western civilization rather than re-embracing the roots of what brought them. And so I think that, look, there's something dangerous about our values. The thing that's dangerous about our values is that it comes with a certain level of obligation and responsibility to do the right thing, to act responsibly in the world, to try and, in Jordan's phraseology, bring order from chaos. And when you're living amidst chaos, it's really easy to say, okay, you know what, I want some more order out of this chaos. If you're living in a crap hole, it's very easy to say, I would like to not live in this crap hole right now.
This is why John Adams said that these ideas only work for religious people. They're inadequate for the governing of anybody else.
Right, and I think that what you're seeing now is that there's so many wealthy nations, particularly in Western Europe, that have decided, okay, well, we live amongst this wealth, we live amidst this wealth, but we don't want the responsibility because the responsibility is tiring. And so we're not going to go back to that. Instead, we're just going to go ahead and assume that all of these fundamental roots of our civilization are no longer relevant, and we can sort of live on top of this iceberg without having to worry about the stability of the flow underneath.
Some of it, there's more to it. There's more to it. I mean, it is the case that we produce hierarchical systems to pursue certain ends, and hierarchical systems do tend to generate a certain amount of dispossession, and that hurts people emotionally. You know, if you're walking down the street and there's homeless people everywhere, well, obviously it's hard on the homeless people, but it's hard on everyone to see that level of dispossession. And we don't exactly know what to do with the fact that the tools we use to pursue valid goals socially, so those would be hierarchies, also produce dispossession. And we might say, well, it doesn't matter, you let the hierarchy run and a rising tide will lift all boats, and certainly that seems to be happening, but it doesn't stop the pain of the dispossession. And then there's also the thing that people object to is that, well, the functional hierarchies also become corrupt and cynical and they don't abide by their own principles. So that would be the corruption that's endemic to the system. And so the leftists who are objecting to that, when they're actually thinking, say, well, what about the problem of the dispossessed? That's the widows and the orphans, let's say. And what about the fact of corruption in the current hierarchies? And the answer to that should be, well, yeah, we have to think about something to do with dispossessed. I'm really concerned about this primarily, let's say, with regards to the cognitive distribution, because it isn't obvious what the people who have IQs of less than 85 are going to do. You say, well, they should get their act together and they should act morally. It's like, yes, that's kind of instantiated in conscientiousness, and that will help, but it won't help enough. They're still facing a competition that they cannot fully participate in, and no one knows what to do about that. And so that's, you know, that's to give the left its due. That doesn't mean it's also not driven by envy and all sorts of other terrible things.
Families just, I mean, if somebody is so
it's a lot of people. It's 15% of the population.
Well, yikes. They have,
yeah,
I hope
yikes.
they have family. You know,
Yikes
but,
is right.
You know, to take it away from the left and take their due away from them. You know, don't you think that the family, which is taking care of stupid people for virtually all of human history,
and
is
the
more
church.
like. And the church, the family and the community and the church and the parish should do a better job of it than, say, some federal policy.
Could be. I'm not advocating for the fact that the state is necessarily the proper locale of that care. What I'm saying is that hierarchies of competence, functional hierarchies of competence, do produce dispossession.
That's
right.
Well,
and so it has to be dealt with somehow.
Well, and this is the big problem of the disconnectedness between those hierarchies and the continuation of Judeo-Christian values, right? And this is the problem of that essentially, you know, you could say that Nietzsche almost was tackling when he was talking about the possibility of the Ubermensch, and there's a certain group of people who are beyond morality, and then there's the rest of us. If you leave Christianity, like he ripped into Christianity in pretty stark terms in a lot of his writings for being a religion that was supposedly predicated on what you do with the weak, and it was the weak overcoming the strong. And the reality
he was interested in the envious element of it.
Exactly, and the reality is that without the idea that the strong do have some obligation to the weak, at least within their communities and within their family structure, that you do end up with this bifurcation where the hierarchies create prosperity for everyone, but they also leave an enormous number of people behind, and then you're not supposed to care about the people
and also
who are left behind.
in ways that I don't think we're dealing with yet in a sophisticated manner, because the leftists will say, for example, how about a guaranteed annual income, something like that, a guaranteed minimal income, and I think, wait a minute, you guys are solving the wrong problem. Is that what you really want for the people who are dispossessed is to have something meaningful to engage in. Now, that also provides economic stability, but they have to have a place. And so maybe what the right needs to do, to the degree that the right needs to do something, is to expand the conception of that responsibility to ensure that we build into our ideas of success also the looking down to the dispossessed and taking care of them. And I think that is built into, well, certainly built into most functional religious systems.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's something that
like
perhaps
Israel has
has
started
to
do something pretty incredible, actually. They've taken people who have mental problems, people who have Down syndrome, for example, and they actually allow them to serve in the army. They give them army service, and then they actually give them tasks to do. And it's not always menial tasks. Sometimes it's just to go and meet with kids. They give them something to do. Giving people something to do, it's because we're such materialists now, we think that if we sign somebody a check, everything is better.
Yeah, no.
And it's
Look,
It
I've
goes
had
back to just the
clients.
Aristotelian notion of happiness that we started the conversation tonight with, right? That happiness is found in the fulfillment of pursuing something
Meaningful.
meaningful.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, I've had clients who had nothing to do, who got unemployment checks. And it was devastating for them. Like, these are often people who are addicted. It was like, as long as they were flat broke, they were not dying. But it wasn't good because they didn't have anything meaningful to engage in. But as soon as their check came along, man, it was like 3 days of cocaine and alcohol face down in the ditch. Well, like money in and of itself is not a good. And this is something that both the right and the left have to remember. And it isn't clear, what is it? Man does not live by bread alone, right? It's just because you give the poor. First of all, the cause of poverty is not insufficient money. That's a cause of poverty, but it's certainly not the cause of poverty. And it's not easy to rectify the multiple causes of poverty with money. It would be really easy if that was the case in some sense. What's much more difficult is to figure out how to take the people who are increasingly going to be left behind too as our culture becomes more cognitively complex, and to figure out, okay, well, what is a genuinely functional role? Where's the space for them in the culture that also provides them with sufficient economic security?
You know, one of the things about the right, and the right, I think, does have, I hope, a proper concern for those left behind, but it always has a concern for freedom, and it always worries that if your property becomes, if you can take away somebody's property to feed the poor, that you are limiting his freedom. You came to prominence really in a fight, a battle with your government over the freedom to speak, over the freedom to use the pronoun that you felt was appropriate, and fighting against the law. That is what I remember the first time you and I spoke.
Freedom to not have the damn government impose compelled speech on me,
Right.
regardless of the reason. I don't care about the compassion that justifies that. It's like nothing justifies that.
So that's exactly, that is my point, that nothing, just no compassion justifies.
Especially no false compassion.
The abridgment of freedom. Where does that stand now?
It's passed.
It's passed. The law passed.
Well, and one of the
16,
consequences of that was the biggest scandal that ever hit a Canadian university, because a teaching assistant named Lindsay Shepherd had the temerity to show one of my videos on public television from a mainstream news show in her communications class, and the leftist professors went after her, two of them and an administrator, telling her basically that she violated Bill C-16, which was probably not true, by the way, but that's what they told her, and had an administrator tangled in there as well, and really raked her over the coals, and she recorded it and released it. And so it was the biggest university scandal that ever occurred in Canada. She's suing them now, and so am I, as of last month, because they didn't stop harassing her in the aftermath of that, even though they said there was no student complaint about the video, even though that's what they said to begin with, even though the university publicly apologized, said that she had done nothing wrong, committed to a dialogue, or committed to a structure that made free speech paramount, but undermined that at every possible opportunity. They kept tormenting her for a whole year. And that was a perfect example of what I saw as the danger of the kind of policies that led to Bill C-16.
So are you in continual violation of this bill?
No, I've never been in violation of it, because I've actually never refused to address someone by their requested pronoun. That just never came up.
I see.
Well, in the spirit of Bill C-16, I guess we do have to ask, Jordan, what is your
What is your
preferred pronoun?
Yeah.
Sir, Lord, my Lord.
My preferred pronoun
Doctor.
is whatever one you think you can use.
How long do you think it is before somebody actually tries to trap you into this while you're speaking in Canada?
Oh, well, I don't know if they would trap me because, well, it's hard to say. It hasn't happened yet. I mean, I've spoken with transsexual people online, on TV shows, and Theron Meyer in particular, who's actually quite a libertarian.
Yeah, I like
I mean, I
Theron
just
Meyer.
used she. Well, why? Well, because it just seemed to be the appropriate thing in the context, you know? I wasn't objecting to the damn pronouns, even though the proliferation of the pronouns is pure idiocy. And the reason that this is being pushed has nothing to do with compassion for transgender people, or maybe a little bit, but very, very little. I was opposed to the idea of compelled speech, and what else was being built into the legislation was the insistence in legislation that gender identity was socioculturally constructed, or just a matter of, that's so interesting, it was both. Gender identity is socio-culturally constructed, but it's just a matter of choice. It's like, no, it's one of those. Actually, it's neither of those, but it's certainly not both.
So we have time for one more question, I think, from Subscribers Central, dailywire.com subscribers. Alicia?
Yeah, we have a question for Dr. Peterson from Caroline, and she asks, why do intellectuals and academics gravitate toward collectivist ideologies?
Oh, because they don't get paid enough and they're resentful. No, look, there's some real truth in that. Like, if you look at it structurally, like here's one of the things the universities have done. So as they're devolving, which they're doing extraordinarily rapidly, they've hired more and more adjunct professors, right? And so they don't have tenure. They're not on a tenure track. They get paid abysmally. Some of them live in their damn cars. They teach 4 courses. They don't make enough money. They have to live in their cars. They have no power. They're making like $16,000 to $20,000 a year. It's like that's not going to, so that's a place where plenty of resentment can be generated, and it's a rigged game. So some of it, I think if you tripled the pay of sociology professors, a lot of this would just go away. So I do think, I do believe
It's
that.
so simple, yeah.
Well, it's partly because, you know, as a general rule, the professors are part of the cognitive elite.
Right.
And if you look at what the cognitive elite makes, they make a hell of a lot more on average, especially at the higher end, than people do in academia. Right. And some of that's just driven by jealousy. So,
And out here in the private sector, people want results.
yeah, well, sometimes they do. Sometimes they do. See, I differ on that a little bit because I've watched big corporations, and like big corporations get just as stupid as big government, except that they die faster.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Right, but they're no less stupid.
No,
and I think a part of it is, and this is something that could unite the right and the left to some degree, is like, why don't we agree that really big poses a problem?
Well, this was Andrew Breitbart, the good friend of all of us here except Michael. That's actually because Andrew died too soon, but I also think that had he met you...
He would have hated my guts.
Yeah, that's
I
right.
did happen to miss him in Hollywood, but he would have hated my guts.
But his entire premise was that big is bad.
That's the Tower of Babel. It's like if you build the thing too, but this is why I think the European Union can't sustain itself. It's like there's too many layers between the government and the people. It's too damn big. It gets unwieldy, and big is a problem, not least because Price's law dictates that incompetence increases geometrically and competence increases linearly as you scale. That's a big problem. And so, you know, the left goes, big corporations, aren't they awful? And the right goes, big government, isn't it awful? And the commonality is big. It's like, look out for big. And I think that there's some real truth in that. And so, back to the professor problem. There's lots of problems, but envy is one of them. I also think that we're subsidizing activists like mad. It's like these ideas couldn't make it on their own. It's like dump tuition money to them. And because the universities aren't doing a good job between discriminating between actual scholarship and pseudo-scholarship, we've allowed activism to arise as a discipline, which it isn't. And then, of course, a lot of that's state subsidized. And so that's not helpful either.
Well, at least we've come up with a solution for the people with IQs under 85.
Yeah.
On that note, I think it's probably time for us to say adieu, which is French for something. Alicia, thank you so much for fielding questions for us this evening, and thanks to all of our dailywire.com subscribers for sending your questions in for Dr. Peterson and for the rest of us here on the panel. I think that the sort of closing thought here, because we've strayed mightily from our conversation of America's independence, except in this, that really the great gift of the West is that we can sit here and pretend to smoke cigars because Dr. Peterson's with us, and eat crappy food and talk about whatever the hell we want. And if people want to listen to us, they can.
Amazing thing.
It's an amazing thing.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for spending your afternoon together, and we'll see you next time at Daily Wire Backstage.